More than 800 years ago, on the cold, windswept grasslands of Mongolia, a boy was born into a small, nomadic tribe. He had no palace, no kingdom, and no reason to believe he would one day change the world. But over the next decades, that boy would unite the tribes of the steppe and lead armies across deserts, mountains, and continents. His name was Temujin. History would remember him as Genghis Khan, and the empire he built would become the largest land empire the world had ever seen. Tonight, we will slowly travel through that story. From the quiet life of the Mongolian steppe to the rise of an empire that reshaped half the world. So settle in, relax, and let the long winds of history carry you back through time. The story begins far from the great cities of the medieval world, far from the stone castles of Europe, and far from the crowded markets of China. It begins in a place that seems almost endless, a land of wind, grass, and sky. This is the Mongolian steppe. If you were standing here centuries ago, you might first notice the silence. Not the silence of empty rooms, but the wide silence of open land. The wind moves slowly across the grass. Horses graze quietly in the distance. Clouds drift across an enormous blue sky. The horizon stretches so far that the earth itself seems to curve away. In the winter, this land becomes a world of ice and snow. Temperatures can fall below -40 degrees. The wind grows sharp and unforgiving. Snowstorms sweep across the plains, and survival becomes a daily challenge. In the summer, the opposite arrives. The sun burns down from the sky. The grasses dry beneath the heat. Rivers shrink into narrow streams, and dust rises beneath the hooves of animals. For thousands of years, people have lived here. They did not build large cities. They did not construct great monuments of stone. Instead, they lived a life of movement. Families traveled with their animals. They followed the seasons, searching for fresh pasture. Their homes were round tents made of wood and thick felt. These homes were called yurts. A yurt could be assembled in less than an hour, and when the time came to move again, it could be taken apart just as quickly. Inside the yurt, life was warm and simple. A small fire burned in the center. Cooking pots hung above the flame. Furs and blankets lined the floor. Outside, the world remained vast and unpredictable. Children of the steppe grew up differently from children in distant kingdoms. Almost as soon as they could walk, they learned to ride horses. Riding was not a sport here, it was survival. A child who could ride could travel. A rider could follow the herds. A rider could hunt. A rider could escape danger, and so, from a very young age, boys and girls alike learned to guide their small steppe horses across the grasslands. The horse became more than an animal. It became a partner. Mongol riders could travel extraordinary distances. A warrior often owned several horses, switching between them during long journeys. This allowed them to move faster than almost any other army of their time. But in the centuries before our story truly begins, the tribes of the steppe were divided. There was no single ruler, no united kingdom. Instead, dozens of clans competed for survival. Some tribes were small, others were powerful. Alliances formed and collapsed again. Old rivalries stretched back for generations. A tribe might share a meal with its neighbors one year and raid their camps the next. Cattle were stolen. Horses were taken. Prisoners were captured. Sometimes entire families disappeared into slavery. The steppe could be a harsh teacher. Strength mattered, but so did loyalty. A leader who could not protect his followers quickly lost them, and a tribe without strong allies rarely survived for long. Beyond the grasslands, great civilizations already existed. To the south, China had vast cities and powerful dynasties. to the west, how Persia and the Islamic world flourished with trade and learning. To the far west, European kingdoms fought their own wars. Yet for many of these distant civilizations, the steppe remained mysterious. It was a place where riders appeared suddenly from the horizon and disappeared just as quickly. Occasionally, tribes from the steppe invaded settled lands. They came on horseback, moving faster than traditional armies. But these invasions were usually temporary. Sooner or later, the tribes returned to the grasslands, and the world beyond the steppe continued much as before. But in the late 12th century, something began to change. Among the scattered tribes of Mongolia, a new leader slowly began to rise. At first, almost no one noticed. He did not command a great army. He did not control vast lands. And in fact, his early life was marked by poverty, danger, and betrayal. There were years when his family struggled simply to find enough food. There were moments when it seemed his story might end before it had truly begun. Yet slowly, over many difficult seasons, this young man gathered followers. Some joined him because they trusted him. Others joined because they believed he offered something rare on the steppe: opportunity. Instead of judging men by their birth, he judged them by their loyalty, their courage, and their ability. This idea was unusual among the tribes, but it proved powerful. Gradually, small groups became larger ones. Friends became warriors. Warriors became an army. And the tribes that had once been divided began to unite. A few people living at that time could imagine how far this movement would go. Within a few decades, these riders would cross deserts, climb mountains, and travel across continents. Cities that had stood for centuries would fall. Empires would tremble, and the map of the world would begin to change. The man who led this transformation would later be known by many names. Some would remember him as a conqueror, others would remember him as a lawgiver, and some would remember him simply as the man who united the Mongols. But at the beginning of our story, he was only a child, a boy born on the windswept steppe. His name was Temujin, and the quiet grasslands of Mongolia were about to change the course of history. The quiet winds of the Mongolian steppe continued to move across the grasslands, just as they had for countless generations. Horses still wandered across the open plains. Nomadic families still traveled slowly with their herds. And beneath the enormous sky, life followed the ancient rhythm of the land. But somewhere within this vast landscape, a small story was beginning. A story that, at first, seemed no different from the lives of thousands of other children born on the steppe. It was the story of a boy named Temujin. Temujin was born sometime around the year 1162. The exact date has been lost to history, but the legends surrounding his birth would later become famous across Asia. According to Mongol tradition, when the infant Temujin first opened his tiny hand, his family noticed something unusual. Clutched in his palm was a small clot of dark blood. Among the nomadic tribes of the steppe, this was considered a powerful omen. It was said that children born this way were destined for greatness, destined for war, destined to lead. Of course, stories told after great events often grow larger over time. Yet, for the people who would later follow Temujin, this small detail became a symbol of fate. But at the moment of his birth, Temujin's life looked very ordinary. He belonged to the Borjigin clan, one of the many Mongol tribes scattered across the steppe. His father was a minor tribal leader named Yesugei. Yesugei was not a great king. He did not rule a large kingdom. Instead, he was what many steppe leaders were: a respected warrior, a man who had gathered a small group of followers, a man whose authority depended on loyalty and strength. Temujin's mother was a woman named Hoolun. Her story was also shaped by the harsh customs of the steppe. Years earlier, Yasuge had captured her during a tribal raid and taken her as his wife. Although this practice might seem brutal to modern readers, such marriages were not uncommon among nomadic tribes. Over time, Hoelun became one of the strongest figures in Temujin's early life. She was intelligent, resilient, and deeply protective of her children. Together, Yasuge and Hoelun raised several sons and daughters. Their camp moved with the seasons. Spring brought new grass for the herds. Summer meant long days beneath the open sky. Autumn was a time to prepare for the cold. And winter. Winter demanded endurance. Young Temujin grew up surrounded by this constant movement. From an early age, he watched the adults manage animals, repair saddles, and prepare for journeys across the plains. Children of the steppe learned quickly. There was little room for laziness in a nomadic life. By the time Temujin was only a few years old, he had already begun learning to ride. The small Mongol horses were perfectly suited to the land. They were not tall or elegant like the horses of European knights. Instead, they were strong, compact, and incredibly resilient. These horses could survive harsh winters by digging through snow to reach frozen grass. They could travel long distances with little food, and they formed deep bonds with their riders. Temujin spent countless hours in the saddle. He learned how to guide a horse across uneven ground. He learned how to stay balanced while the animal galloped across the plains. And slowly, he began to practice archery. The Mongol bow was a remarkable weapon. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it was small enough to use on horseback, yet powerful enough to strike targets at impressive distances. For a young boy on the steppe, learning to use this bow was not simply a game. It was preparation for survival, because the tribes of Mongolia did not live in peace. Rivalries were everywhere. Clans fought for grazing lands. Old feuds were remembered. Alliances shifted constantly. A family that felt safe one year might find itself under attack the next. Temujin grew up hearing stories of these conflicts. He listened to the warriors talk around the evening fires. He watched as scouts returned with news of other tribes moving across the plains. And slowly, the young boy began to understand something important. On the steppe, power was never permanent. A tribe could be strong today and destroyed tomorrow. Loyalty mattered, courage mattered, but perhaps most important of all was the ability to gather people together, to create unity where division once existed. At the time, Temujin could not have known how deeply this lesson would shape his future. For now, he was simply a boy learning the ways of the steppe. But an event was approaching, an event that would change his life forever. When Temujin was about 9 years old, his father Yasuge decided the time had come to arrange an important alliance. Among the Mongol tribes, marriage was more than a personal matter. It was a political decision. Through marriage, two families could strengthen their relationship. Two tribes could create peace between them. And so, Yasuge took young Temujin on a journey across the steppe. Their destination was the camp of another tribe. There, Temujin met a girl named Borte. She was close to his age, and according to tradition, she would one day become his wife. For the moment, Temujin would remain with Borte's family. This custom allowed the young boy to learn about the tribe he would later join through marriage. Everything seemed to be unfolding according to the quiet traditions of steppe life. But on the journey home, something unexpected happened. Yasuge stopped to share a meal with members of the Tatar tribe. The Tatars had once been enemies of Yasuge, yet hospitality on the steppe was a powerful tradition. Travelers were rarely refused food or drink, and so Yasuge accepted their invitation. The meal seemed ordinary, but the Tatars recognized who he was. Quietly, they decided to take revenge for past conflicts. Poison was slipped into his food. Yasuge managed to leave their camp, but the poison had already begun its slow work. As he rode across the grasslands toward home, his strength faded. The leader who had guided Temujin's early childhood would soon be gone. And with his death, the fragile protection around Temujin's family would disappear. The winds of the steppe would grow colder. Old allies would turn away, and the boy named Temujin would soon face the most difficult years of his life. But those hardships, as painful as they were, would slowly shape the leader he would one day become. And in the next part of our story, the quiet struggles of a young family abandoned on the steppe will begin to reveal the resilience that would eventually change the history of the world. The winds of the Mongolian steppe continued to move across the wide grasslands, just as they always had. The seasons changed slowly. Spring grasses grew beneath the melting snow. Summer sunlight stretched across the plains. Autumn brought colder nights and longer shadows, and winter waited patiently beyond the horizon. For most tribes of the steppe, life followed this quiet and predictable rhythm. But for the family of the young boy Temujin, everything was about to change. After leaving the camp of the Tatars, Temujin's father Yasuge rode home across the open land. At first, he tried to ignore the growing weakness in his body. The poison he had unknowingly swallowed was working slowly. Each hour, his strength faded a little more. By the time he finally reached his camp, he could barely remain in the saddle. His family gathered around him. They listened as he struggled to speak. Yasuge understood what was happening. Among the tribes of the steppe, death was never far away. He knew he did not have much time left. Soon after, the leader of the Borjigin household was gone. For a moment, the camp remained quiet. The fire still burned in the center of the yurt. The horses still grazed nearby, but something invisible had already begun to change. Without Yasuge, the small group of followers who had once supported him began to reconsider their loyalty. On the steppe, power depended on strength. A leader who could not protect his people could not keep them. One by one, the families who had once ridden beside Yasuge began to leave. They packed their belongings, they gathered their animals, and they followed new leaders across the grasslands. Temujin's family watched as their protection slowly disappeared. Within a short time, they were almost completely alone. Temujin's mother, Hoelun, suddenly faced an enormous challenge. She had several young children to care for, but she no longer had a tribe to support them, no warriors to defend them, no large herds of animals to provide food. For many families of the steppe, such a situation could quickly become fatal. Winter storms could arrive suddenly. Food could become scarce. Enemies could appear without warning. But Hoelun refused to surrender. She gathered her children together, and slowly, patiently, she began teaching them how to survive on their own. The family learned to live from the land. They searched for wild roots hidden beneath the soil. They gathered berries and edible plants along the rivers. Temujin and his brothers learned to catch fish in the shallow streams. Sometimes they hunted small animals like marmots or birds. Every meal required effort. Nothing came easily. There were days when the family ate well enough, and there were days when hunger remained their constant companion. Yet these difficult years became an important part of Temujin's life. He watched his mother work tirelessly to keep the family alive. He saw her strength, her determination, her refusal to accept defeat. In later years, many historians would suggest that Hoelun's resilience helped shape Temujin's own character. She taught him that survival required patience, that hardship could be endured, and that family loyalty must never be broken. But life in the small camp was not always peaceful. Inside the family itself, tensions began to grow. Yasuge had several sons from different wives. Among them was an older half-brother named Bekter. Bekter believed that he should become the leader of the household. After all, he was the eldest male. In many steppe families, that position naturally belonged to the oldest son. But Temujin did not see the situation the same way. He believed that leadership required more than age. It required strength, skill, and the respect of others. Small disagreements between the brothers slowly turned into arguments. Arguments grew into resentment. In a world where survival depended on unity, this division was dangerous. One day, while the brothers were out hunting, the tension finally reached its breaking point. Temujin and his younger brother Qasr confronted Bekter. The moment was brief, but it would echo through Temujin's life forever. Bekter was killed. For Temujin, this was not a victory. It was a heavy and troubling step. When the brothers returned to the camp, their mother Hoelun was furious. She scolded them harshly. According to later Mongol chronicles, she reminded them that their true enemies were outside the family, not within it. Her anger carried deep wisdom. But the event had already changed the balance of power in the camp. From that moment forward, Temujin became the leader of the household. He was still young, still learning, but responsibility had arrived earlier than expected. The steppe did not offer second chances, and the challenges facing Temujin were far from over. Beyond the small camp, other tribes were watching. Among them were the Taichiud. This tribe had once been connected to Temujin's family, but relationships on the steppe were rarely permanent. Soon, the Taichiud decided that the growing young leader might become a problem, and so they moved against him. Temujin was captured. His captors placed a heavy wooden collar around his neck. The device was large and uncomfortable. It made running almost impossible. Prisoners forced to wear such collars were often kept as slaves. For many people in Temujin's position, escape would have been impossible. But Temujin had spent his childhood learning patience. He waited, he observed, he studied the habits of the guards, and one night, when the camp grew quiet, he made his move. Under the cover of darkness, Temujin slipped away. The heavy wooden collar still hung around his shoulders. He ran across the grasslands. Then he reached a nearby river. There, he lowered himself into the cold water. Only his nose and eyes remained above the surface. The collar floated around him. When the guards searched the area, they passed by without noticing him. Eventually, a man from a nearby family discovered Temujin hiding in the water. Instead of returning him to the Taichiud, the man made a quiet decision. He helped the young prisoner escape. Acts of kindness were rare in the violent world of the steppe, but Temujin never forgot them. In later years, when he became a powerful leader, he rewarded those who had once helped him. This memory would become one of the foundations of his rule. Loyalty, once earned, was never ignored. As Temujin finally returned to his small family camp, the future remained uncertain. He still had few followers, few animals, few resources. Yet something important had begun to grow within him, the understanding that leadership could be built slowly, through trust, through courage, through shared hardship. And in the next part of our story, the young survivor of the steppe will begin gathering the first allies who will eventually help him reshape the destiny of Mongolia. The rise of Temujin has only just begun. The young Temujin had survived another trial of the steppe. He had escaped captivity, he had returned to his family, and once again, the quiet life of the grasslands seemed to resume. But something had changed. The boy who had once struggled simply to survive was slowly becoming something more. The hardships of his childhood had taught him lessons that many warriors would learn only much later in life. He had seen how quickly allies could disappear. He had felt the cold weight of hunger. He had learned how dangerous isolation could be, and perhaps most importantly, he had begun to understand the value of loyalty. The small camp where Temujin lived remained modest. His family still had few animals. Their resources were limited, but slowly, Temujin began to reconnect with people who had once known his father. On the Mongolian steppe, relationships were rarely forgotten. Old friendships could sometimes be renewed. And so Temujin began traveling quietly across the grasslands. He met men who had once ridden beside Yesugei. Some of them remembered the young boy. Others remembered the kindness of his mother Holun. A few of them decided to help. At first, their numbers were small, a handful of riders, a few families. But in the world of the steppe, even a small group could grow quickly if trust was strong. During this time, another important part of Temujin's life returned. The young woman named Borte. Years earlier, Temujin's father had arranged their future marriage. Now that Temujin had grown older, he traveled to the camp of Borte's family. The two were married according to the traditions of the steppe. Borte was intelligent and strong-willed. Many historians believe she played an important role in Temujin's life. Her presence brought stability. Her advice often carried quiet influence, but their early happiness did not last long. Not long after their marriage, danger returned. A tribe known as the Merkit launched a sudden raid. Raids were common on the steppe. They happened quickly, often during the night. Riders would appear from the darkness. Tents would be torn open. Animals would be driven away. Prisoners would be captured. When the Merkit attacked Temujin's camp, they were seeking revenge for an old event involving Temujin's father. And during the chaos of the raid, they captured Borte. She was carried away across the steppe. For Temujin, this moment was devastating. But it also forced him to make an important decision. He could not rescue Borte alone. His small group of followers was not strong enough. If he wanted to save her, he would need allies. And so Temujin turned to two powerful figures on the steppe. The first was a man named Togrul. Togrul was the leader of the Khwarezmia tribe. He was often called Wang Khan. Years earlier, Togrul had shared a friendship with Temujin's father Yesugei. Because of this connection, Temujin believed Togrul might help him. Temujin traveled to Togrul's camp. He brought gifts, and he reminded the older leader of his father's loyalty. Togrul listened carefully. After some time, he agreed to support Temujin. But there was another ally Temujin hoped to gain, a young leader named Jamuka. Jamuka had once been Temujin's close childhood companion. The two boys had sworn a traditional bond of brotherhood. In Mongol culture, such a bond was called an anda. An anda was more than a friend. It was a brother chosen by loyalty. Temujin rode across the steppe to find Jamuka. When they met again, their old friendship returned quickly. Jamuka agreed to join the rescue mission. Soon, a small coalition was forming. Temujin, Jamuka, and the powerful Wang Khan. Together, their forces were strong enough to challenge the Merkit. The riders gathered. Horses were prepared. Weapons were sharpened, and quietly, they began moving across the grasslands. The Merkit had not expected such a response. They believed Temujin was still weak, still isolated, but the alliance moving toward them told a different story. When the attack finally came, it came swiftly. Mongol warfare was built on speed and surprise. The coalition struck the Merkit camps with sudden force. The Merkit were scattered. Some fled into the forests. Others tried to regroup, but the momentum of the attack was too strong. During the chaos of the battle, Temujin searched for Borte, and eventually she was found. Her rescue was more than a personal victory. It marked the first major success of Temujin's leadership. He had gathered allies, he had organized a coordinated attack, and he had defeated a rival tribe. A word of this success began to spread across the steppe. Among the nomadic tribes, reputation mattered greatly. A leader who achieved victory attracted followers. Warriors wanted to join successful leaders. Families wanted protection. Opportunity began drawing people toward Temujin, but the alliance that had helped him succeed also contained hidden tensions. Jamuka and Temujin had once been brothers, yet their visions of leadership were very different. Jamuka believed that noble families should rule. He believed leadership belonged to those born into powerful clans. Temujin saw the world differently. He valued loyalty above noble birth. He rewarded skill and courage. Even men from humble backgrounds could rise within his growing group. At first, these differences remained quiet. The two leaders continued working together. But the seeds of future conflict had already been planted, and slowly, as Temujin's influence continued to grow, the friendship between the two Andas would begin to strain. Because on the steppe, power rarely remained shared for long. In the next part of our story, the brotherhood between Temujin and Jamuka will begin to fracture, and the struggle for leadership of the Mongol tribes will slowly move toward open war. The victory over the Merkit had brought Temujin something he had never truly possessed before: recognition. Across the Mongolian steppe, stories traveled quickly. Riders carried news from one camp to another. Warriors spoke around evening fires. Families discussed the shifting balance of power among the tribes. And slowly, the name Temujin began to appear in more and more conversations. At first, these stories were simple. They spoke of a young leader who had gathered allies, a man who had rescued his captured wife, a man who had defeated the Merkit. But on the steppe, success rarely remained quiet for long. Where success appeared, followers soon followed. Warriors looking for opportunity began to arrive at Temujin's camp. Some were young men seeking adventure. Others were experienced fighters who had grown tired of serving weaker leaders. Temujin welcomed them. Unlike many tribal chiefs of the steppe, he did not judge men only by their family background. He cared more about loyalty, skill, and courage. This approach slowly began to attract a different kind of follower. Men who might have remained insignificant in other tribes now found new chances within Temujin's growing circle. A talented rider could become a trusted warrior. A brave fighter could become a leader of others. On the steppe, this idea was unusual. For generations, power had mostly belonged to noble families. But Temujin's camp was beginning to operate differently, and this difference did not go unnoticed. Among those watching carefully was Jamuka. Jamuka had once been Temujin's closest companion. When they were young, the two had sworn their bond as Anda. They had promised to treat one another as brothers, and for a time, their friendship had been genuine. After the rescue of Borte, Jamuka and Temujin continued traveling together with their followers. Their combined forces were strong. Their camps were lively. Warriors shared stories. Horses grazed across the wide plains. At night, fires burned beneath the enormous sky. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, their visions of leadership were slowly beginning to separate. Jamuka believed deeply in the traditional structure of Mongol society. He believed noble blood mattered. He believed that powerful families should hold authority. Leadership, in his view, belonged to those born into the right clans. Temujin believed something very different. His difficult childhood had taught him that noble birth meant little without loyalty. He had survived because of unexpected allies. He had escaped captivity because a stranger had chosen kindness. For Temujin, trust and ability mattered more than ancestry. As more warriors gathered around the two leaders, these differences became harder to ignore. One evening, an event occurred that symbolized the growing divide. According to later Mongol chronicles, a disagreement broke out between followers of the two camps. A young man who had once served as a simple herdsman had been given a position of responsibility by Temujin. Jamuka's supporters found this offensive. To them, leadership should not be given so easily. The argument grew tense, words became sharp, and slowly, the unity between the two camps began to fade. Not long afterward, Jamuka made a decision. He separated his followers from Temujin's group. The two former brothers, once united by loyalty, now rode in different directions across the steppe. The division was quiet at first, but everyone understood what it meant. Two leaders were now competing for influence among the Mongol tribes. In the years that followed, the conflict would grow larger. Temujin continued building his following. More warriors joined him. Families moved their camps closer to his territory. He rewarded loyalty carefully. He remembered those who supported him, and he punished betrayal firmly. Jamuka also gathered support. Many traditional noble families preferred his leadership. They believed the old ways of the steppe should remain unchanged. The rivalry between the two leaders slowly expanded into a wider struggle. Tribes began choosing sides. Some joined Jamuka. Others joined Temujin. The open grasslands of Mongolia, once filled with scattered tribes, were beginning to divide into two growing coalitions. Eventually, a conflict could no longer be avoided. The first battles between the two sides began. These early encounters were fierce. Both leaders understood the tactics of steppe warfare. Both commanded skilled riders. Both moved their forces quickly across the land. But Temujin possessed one advantage that would soon become decisive. His followers trusted him deeply. Many of them had risen from humble beginnings. Their loyalty was personal. They believed in the future he promised. This bond between leader and follower gave Temujin's growing army remarkable cohesion. And, as the struggle continued, that cohesion slowly began to tip the balance of power. The steppe was entering a new era. The scattered tribes of Mongolia were being drawn into a larger conflict, a conflict that would eventually determine who would rule the steppe. And in the next part of our story, Temujin's reforms within his growing army will begin transforming his followers into something far more powerful than a simple tribal force. They were slowly becoming the foundation of the Mongol war machine. The winds of the steppe continued their endless journey across the grasslands, moving through valleys, rolling across hills, and whispering through the tall summer grass. For generations, these winds had carried the sounds of small tribal conflicts, raids, skirmishes, short battles fought between rival clans. But now, a larger struggle was slowly unfolding. The quiet division between Temujin and Jamuka had grown into something far more serious. Across the Mongolian steppe, tribes were beginning to choose sides. Some followed Jamuka. Others rode beside Temujin. And with each passing season, their groups grew larger. Jamuka still commanded great respect among many traditional noble families. He came from an aristocratic background. His supporters believed he represented the ancient customs of the Mongol tribes. To them, leadership belonged to those born into the proper bloodlines. Temujin represented something new, something unfamiliar. His followers were not only nobles, many were ordinary men, former servants, hunters, herders, men who had once held little power within the tribal system. Temujin gave these men opportunity. He gave them responsibility. and in return, they gave him something even more valuable: loyalty. This difference between the two leaders slowly shaped the conflict that was now emerging. Jamuka gathered support from powerful clans. Temujin gathered men who believed their future depended on his success. Eventually, their growing rivalry led to open confrontation. One of the first major clashes between their forces took place near a place remembered in Mongol chronicles as the Battle of the 13 Camps. The name came from the way Temujin had organized his followers. His army had been arranged into 13 separate camps. Each camp contained warriors, families, and herds. It was a practical way to organize a growing force across the wide steppe. Jamuka's army approached with confidence. He had many noble allies, his warriors were experienced, and his reputation was strong. The two forces met across the open grasslands. Horses stood ready. Archers prepared their bows. The quiet tension before battle settled over the plain. Then, the fighting began. Mounted archers raced across the field. Arrows flew through the air. Warriors circled one another at high speed. Steppe warfare was fast and fluid. Unlike the slow battles of heavily armored soldiers in distant lands, Mongol riders moved constantly. They attacked, they withdrew, they repositioned. Dust rose into the air as horses thundered across the ground. The battle lasted for hours. Neither side gained a clear advantage at first. Both leaders understood the tactics of the steppe. Both commanded skilled riders. But eventually, Jamuka's forces began to gain the upper hand. Temujin's army suffered losses. His coalition of followers was still relatively new. Some of his allies were inexperienced. When the battle finally ended, Jamuka held the field. For Temujin, and this defeat was painful, but it was also instructive. He carefully studied what had happened. He examined the weaknesses in his army, and instead of retreating into despair, he began planning changes. Meanwhile, Jamuka made a decision that would shape his reputation in a very different way. After the battle, several young men who had once supported Jamuka were captured. They had switched sides and joined Temujin. Jamuka viewed this as betrayal, and according to the historical chronicle known as the Secret History of the Mongols, he chose a brutal punishment. 70 of these captured young men were executed. They were killed in a particularly harsh way that shocked many who heard the story. Among the tribes of the steppe, violence was not unusual, but this act seemed excessive even by the standards of that time. Word of the execution spread quickly and slowly. Jamuka's reputation began to change. Some tribes continued to support him, but others became uneasy. They wondered what kind of leader punished his own former followers with such severity. Temujin heard these stories as well. He did not respond with immediate revenge. Instead, he continued focusing on strengthening his own growing army. Temujin believed the tribes of the steppe needed something different. They needed unity, they needed discipline, and they needed a new way of organizing power. Over the next several years, he began introducing reforms. Rather than grouping warriors by tribal origin, he reorganized them into mixed units. Men from different clans served together. Their loyalty would belong not to a tribe, but to the army itself. He also began promoting individuals based on skill. A talented warrior could become a commander. A loyal soldier could rise in rank. These ideas slowly transformed his forces. His army became more organized, more disciplined, more adaptable. It was no longer simply a collection of tribal riders. It was becoming something much more powerful, a structured military force. Across the steppe, people began noticing the difference. Temujin's followers grew steadily. Families moved their camps closer to his territory. Warriors traveled long distances to join him. And slowly, The balance of power between the two rivals began to shift. The early defeat at the Battle of the 13 Camps had not ended Temujin's ambitions. Instead, it had strengthened his determination. He understood that the struggle for control of the steppe would not be decided by a single battle. It would require patience, strategy, and the ability to inspire loyalty over many years. As the seasons passed, Temujin's army continued to evolve, and in the next part of our story, his reforms would begin producing results that few leaders of the steppe had ever achieved. The tribes of Mongolia, once divided for generations, were slowly beginning to move toward unity. The winds of the steppe moved slowly through the tall grass, carrying with them the quiet passage of time. Seasons continued to change across Mongolia. Snow fell in winter, grass returned in spring, and the wide plains stretched endlessly beneath the sky. But beneath this calm landscape, something important was beginning to take shape. The scattered tribes of the Mongolian steppe had lived in division for generations. Small conflicts, temporary alliances, short-lived leaders. Yet now, for the first time in many years, a single name was slowly becoming known across the plains: Temujin. After the difficult battles with Jamuka, Temujin had learned something crucial. Victory on the steppe did not depend only on courage. It depended on organization. It depended on loyalty. And it depended on the ability to unite people who had once been enemies. Over the following years, Temujin began strengthening his position carefully. He did not rush into reckless battles. Instead, he built relationships, he gathered followers, and he restructured his growing army. One of the most important changes he introduced was the breaking of traditional tribal divisions. For centuries, warriors had fought beside members of their own clan. Loyalty belonged first to the tribe, and only second to the leader. Temujin reversed this structure. He reorganized his forces into units that mixed men from different tribes together. A warrior might serve beside someone whose family had once been an enemy. Over time, this arrangement created something new. Their loyalty shifted away from tribal identity and toward their commander, toward Temujin himself. This simple idea would become one of the most powerful foundations of the Mongol military system. Another change followed. Temujin began promoting individuals based on merit. A skilled warrior could rise in rank. A brave fighter could command others. Even men who had once been servants or herders could become leaders if they proved themselves loyal and capable. This was very unusual for the steppe. Many traditional nobles disliked it. But for ordinary warriors, the system was inspiring. They knew their future depended on ability rather than birth. Slowly, Temujin's army grew stronger, more disciplined, more organized. But military reform alone would not unite the steppe. Temujin also needed to deal with the tribes that had once harmed his family. Among these were the Tatars. The Tatars had long been enemies of Temujin's father Yesugei. They were the tribe responsible for poisoning him many years earlier. Their power remained significant across parts of eastern Mongolia. Eventually, Temujin decided the time had come to confront them. But this time, he did not act alone. Temujin formed an alliance with the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin rulers had their own reasons for opposing the Tatars. The Tatars had often raided their frontier territories. Working together, the Mongol and Jin forces launched a campaign against the Tatar tribes. The fighting that followed was swift. Temujin's reorganized army moved quickly across the grasslands. His warriors were disciplined. His commanders followed clear orders. The Tatars were defeated. For Temujin, this victory carried deep personal meaning. It was a form of justice for the death of his father. But it also demonstrated something larger. His leadership was working. His army was effective. and tribes across the steppe were beginning to recognize his strength. After the defeat of the Tatars, many smaller clans began joining Temujin voluntarily. Some came seeking protection. Others came hoping for opportunity within his growing movement. Each new group increased his influence. Each alliance brought him closer to something that had never existed before: a united Mongol people. Yet the process was not simple. Other powerful tribes still remained. Some resisted Temujin's authority. Others feared losing their independence. And among these rival groups, one leader continued watching carefully: Jamuka. The former brother of Temujin had not disappeared. He still commanded loyal supporters among the aristocratic clans. To many nobles, Jamuka remained the rightful representative of traditional Mongol leadership. And so the rivalry between the two men continued quietly across the steppe. Occasionally, their forces clashed again. Sometimes Temujin gained ground. Sometimes Jamuka's allies resisted successfully. But the overall balance was slowly shifting. Each year, Temujin's following grew. His system of loyalty and merit attracted more warriors. His victories increased his reputation. And perhaps most importantly, his vision of unity began appealing to tribes that had grown tired of endless internal conflict. For generations, the Mongol tribes had weakened themselves through constant rivalry. Temujin offered a different future, a future where the tribes could ride together instead of fighting one another, a future where the strength of the steppe could be directed outward rather than inward. Not everyone believed in this vision, but many did, and slowly, the dream of unity began to move closer to reality. As the years passed, Temujin continued defeating rival clans. The Merkits were weakened. The Tatars had already fallen, and other tribes gradually submitted or joined him. The once fragmented world of the Mongolian steppe was beginning to change. For the first time, a single leader was gaining authority over large portions of the grasslands. Yet the final step had not yet arrived. True unity required recognition. It required the agreement of the tribes themselves. In Mongol tradition, such recognition would come through a gathering known as a Kurultai, a great council of tribal leaders. There, decisions of enormous importance would be made, and soon, the tribes of Mongolia would gather for one of the most significant Kurultai meetings in history. At that gathering, Temujin's life would change forever, and the world beyond the steppe would soon begin to feel the consequences, because the man once known simply as Temujin was about to receive a new name, a name that would echo across continents: Genghis Khan. The winds of the Mongolian steppe continued their slow journey across the plains, carrying dust, carrying whispers of distant riders, and carrying the quiet sense that a new chapter of history was approaching. For many years, the tribes of Mongolia had lived divided across the grasslands. Small clans, shifting alliances, endless rivalries. But now, after years of struggle, after battles, after betrayals and victories, something remarkable had begun to happen. More and more tribes were gathering under the leadership of Temujin. The Merkits had been defeated. The Tatars had been broken. Several powerful clans had already joined his growing coalition. Even some former enemies had accepted his authority. Across the steppe, people began to realize that the old world of constant tribal warfare was slowly fading. In its place, a new kind of unity was forming. Yet in Mongol tradition, true authority required recognition from the tribes themselves. A leader could win battles. He could gather followers. But the final confirmation of power came through a great assembly. This gathering was known as a Kurultai. A Kurultai was not simply a meeting. It was one of the most important traditions of the steppe. At these assemblies, tribal leaders met to make decisions that affected the entire Mongol world. They chose leaders. They planned campaigns. They resolved disputes, and they shaped the future of their people. Around the year 1206, such a gathering was called. Representatives from many Mongol tribes traveled across the steppe to attend. They rode for days, sometimes weeks, bringing their families, their warriors, and their herds. As the various groups arrived, a vast camp began to form across the grasslands. Hundreds of yurts appeared across the plain. Horses grazed nearby. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires. The atmosphere was calm, but also filled with anticipation. Everyone understood that something important was about to happen. Temujin himself arrived quietly. By now, his reputation was widely known. Many warriors respected him. Many families trusted him. But the final decision would still rest with the council of tribal leaders. For several days, discussions continued. Elders spoke. Alliances were confirmed. Memories of past conflicts were considered. Gradually, a consensus began to form. The tribes had seen enough division. They had experienced enough years of internal war. Temujin had proven himself capable of uniting them. He had shown discipline. He had rewarded loyalty. And he had created an army stronger than anything the steppe had seen before. Eventually, the leaders reached their decision. During the assembly, Temujin was formally recognized as the supreme leader of the Mongol tribes. But with this recognition, he was also given a new title. From that moment forward, Temujin would be known as Genghis Khan. The meaning of the name has been debated by historians. Some interpret it as universal ruler. Others suggest it means something closer to oceanic leader or supreme Khan. Whatever the exact meaning, its significance was clear. A new era had begun. For the first time in history, the Mongol tribes of the steppe were united under a single ruler. The ceremony itself was simple by the standards of great empires. There were no stone palaces, no golden thrones, only the open sky of the steppe, the wind moving through the grass, and the gathering of tribes who had chosen a leader. Yet the consequences of that moment would soon reach far beyond Mongolia. After his recognition as Genghis Khan, the new leader immediately began organizing the structure of his growing state. One of his most important innovations was the creation of the decimal military system. Instead of organizing warriors by tribal groups, he divided his army into units based on numbers. 10 warriors formed a small unit. 10 of these units formed a group of 100. 10 groups of 100 formed 1,000. And 10 groups of 1,000 created a tumen of 10,000 warriors. This system allowed Genghis Khan to command large forces with remarkable efficiency. Orders could move quickly through the ranks. Commanders were responsible for clearly defined groups of soldiers, and loyalty continued shifting away from tribal identity toward the new Mongol state. Alongside this military organization, Genghis Khan also introduced a system of laws known as the yasa. The yasa was not written down in a single document. Instead, it was a collection of rules and principles that governed life within the Mongol Empire. These laws covered many aspects of society. They emphasized discipline within the army. They punished theft and betrayal severely. They also promoted religious tolerance and fairness among the tribes. For the people of the steppe, the yasa created a sense of order that had rarely existed before. It reminded everyone that loyalty and obedience were essential for unity. As the Kurultai of 1206 slowly came to an end, the leaders of the tribes returned to their camps. Horses were saddled. Families prepared for long journeys home. The vast gathering of yurts gradually disappeared back into the wide landscape. But the steppe itself had changed. The Mongols were no longer simply scattered tribes. They were now a united people. and under the leadership of Genghis Khan, their ambitions would soon expand far beyond the grasslands of Mongolia, because unity had created something powerful, a disciplined army, a clear system of leadership, and a vision that stretched beyond the horizon. In the years that followed, Genghis Khan would begin directing the energy of the Mongol tribes outward, toward the great civilizations that surrounded the steppe, China, Central Asia, and lands far beyond. The quiet grasslands of Mongolia had produced a new leader, and the world was about to feel the thunder of Mongol horses. The great gathering of the Kurultai slowly faded into memory, and the tribes of Mongolia returned to their wide and familiar lands. But the world of the steppe was no longer the same. For the first time in generations, the Mongol tribes had a single ruler, Genghis Khan. The title carried responsibility. Uniting the tribes had been only the first step. Now came a far more difficult challenge, transforming a loose collection of riders into the most effective army the world had ever seen. The Mongols were already excellent horsemen. For centuries, their lives had depended on riding across vast distances. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. A Mongol rider could guide a horse across rough ground, shoot arrows while galloping, and remain in the saddle for many hours without rest. But Genghis Khan understood that skill alone was not enough. If the Mongols were to survive among powerful neighboring civilizations, they would need discipline, they would need structure, and they would need a military system unlike any that existed at the time. One of the first things he reinforced was the decimal organization created after the Kurultai. Warriors were divided into units of 10. These units were called arban. 10 arbans formed a unit of 100, known as a zun. 10 zuns formed a group of 1,000, called a mingan, and 10 mingans created the largest unit, a tumen of 10,000 riders. This structure allowed orders to travel quickly through the ranks. Each commander knew exactly how many warriors he controlled. Each soldier knew his place within the system. The structure also strengthened loyalty. Men within the same unit depended on each other. If one soldier deserted, his entire unit could face punishment. This created a powerful bond of responsibility. The Mongol army soon became known for its remarkable discipline. But organization alone did not explain their effectiveness. The true strength of the Mongol military came from the combination of mobility and strategy. Every Mongol warrior traveled with several horses, often 3, sometimes 5. During long campaigns, a rider would switch horses regularly. While one animal rested, another carried him forward. This allowed Mongol armies to travel extraordinary distances. Sometimes they moved more than 100 kilometers in a single day. For slower armies, this speed was almost impossible to match. Their primary weapon was the composite bow. Unlike simple wooden bows used in many parts of the world, the composite bow was built from several materials. Wood formed the core. Horn strengthened the inner curve. Sinew added flexibility. The result was a short but extremely powerful weapon. It was perfect for mounted warfare. A skilled Mongol archer could release arrows quickly while riding at full speed, and the arrows could strike targets at impressive distances. These archers rarely fought in close formation. Instead, they moved across the battlefield like flowing water. Groups of riders would approach the enemy. Arrows would rain down. Then, just as quickly, they would turn away. One of the most famous Mongol tactics was the feigned retreat. This maneuver required careful discipline. A group of riders would pretend to panic. They would turn their horses and appear to flee. Enemy forces, believing victory was near, often chased them. But the retreat was an illusion. The Mongol riders maintained control of the situation. They drew the enemy farther and farther away from their main force. Eventually, at the moment of their choosing, the Mongols would turn. Fresh units of riders appeared from hidden positions. The pursuing army suddenly found itself surrounded. Many enemies realized the trap too late. This tactic would become one of the most feared strategies of the Mongol armies. But Genghis Khan understood that warfare depended on more than speed and weapons. Communication was equally important. To coordinate large campaigns across enormous distances, the Mongols developed a system known as the Yam. The Yam functioned as a network of relay stations. These stations were placed along important routes across the empire. Messengers riding swift horses could travel between them. When a rider arrived at one station, he received a fresh horse. Then he continued to the next. This system allowed messages to travel hundreds of kilometers with remarkable speed. Orders from Genghis Khan could reach distant armies in only a few days. Information about enemy movements could be reported quickly. In many ways, the Yam acted like the nervous system of the growing Mongol state. It connected distant regions. It allowed coordination across vast landscapes. And it gave Genghis Khan the ability to command campaigns far beyond the Mongolian steppe. As these systems developed, the Mongol army became something entirely new. It was not simply a tribal force. It was an organized military machine, flexible, mobile, disciplined, and led by commanders chosen for their ability rather than their birth. The transformation did not happen overnight. But season by season, campaign by campaign, the effectiveness of the Mongol war machine became clearer. Neighboring states began hearing stories of these riders, stories of armies that appeared suddenly on the horizon, stories of cities that surrendered before battles even began, stories of a leader whose strategies seemed impossible to predict. For the moment, the Mongol armies remained mostly within the regions surrounding their homeland. But that would soon change, because beyond the grasslands, powerful kingdoms and empires waited. Some of them underestimated the riders of the steppe. Others ignored the rumors entirely. But Genghis Khan had already begun looking beyond Mongolia. His attention was slowly turning south, toward the wealthy cities of northern China. And in the next part of our story, the Mongol war machine will face its first great test against one of the largest civilizations on Earth. Beyond the wide grasslands of Mongolia, far to the south, a very different world existed. Where the steppe stretched endlessly beneath open skies, China was a land of cities. Stone walls surrounded crowded streets, markets filled with merchants and travelers. Fields of wheat and rice extended across fertile plains. Rivers carried boats between distant provinces. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had ruled these lands through complex systems of government. Officials recorded taxes. Scholars studied ancient texts, and large armies defended the borders. To many people living in China, the Mongolian steppe seemed distant and uncivilized, a land of wandering riders and scattered tribes. Yet, along the northern frontier, Chinese rulers had long understood that the steppe could never be ignored. Nomadic tribes occasionally raided border towns. Some dynasties built long defensive walls to slow these attacks. Others attempted diplomacy, trading gifts and titles to maintain fragile peace. During the time of Genghis Khan, northern China was ruled by the Jin dynasty. The Jin were not originally Chinese themselves. They were descendants of the Jurchen people from the forests of Manchuria. Many decades earlier, they had conquered northern China and established their own imperial rule. Their capital city, Zhongdu, stood where modern Beijing now rises. Zhongdu was a magnificent city. Tall walls surrounded its streets. Markets bustled with activity. Palaces housed imperial officials and generals. Compared to the simple camps of the steppe, Such cities represented enormous wealth, and for leaders like Genghis Khan, wealth meant resources. Resources meant power. Yet the Mongols did not rush immediately into war with the Jin dynasty. Before confronting such a powerful state, Genghis Khan needed experience with new forms of warfare. Battles on the open steppe were very different from battles against fortified cities. Walls could not be defeated by cavalry alone. Stone gates and defensive towers required different tactics, and so, before challenging the Jin directly, Genghis Khan first turned his attention toward a smaller neighboring kingdom, the Western Xia. Western Xia lay between Mongolia and the Jin territories. Its lands stretched across desert valleys and river basins. Its rulers controlled important trade routes linking Central Asia and China. Although smaller than the Jin Empire, Western Xia still possessed strong fortresses and organized armies. In the early years of the 13th century, Genghis Khan launched his first campaigns against this kingdom. The Mongol riders moved swiftly across the desert plains. Cities and towns faced a new kind of enemy. Unlike traditional armies, the Mongols did not remain in one place for long. They surrounded settlements quickly. They cut off supplies, and they used psychological pressure to force surrender. During these early campaigns, Genghis Khan and his commanders also learned valuable lessons. Chinese and Central Asian engineers possessed knowledge the Mongols had never needed before. They understood siege warfare. They built machines that could launch stones against walls. They constructed ladders and towers for attacking fortifications. Instead of rejecting this unfamiliar technology, Genghis Khan welcomed it. Captured engineers were often spared. Many were brought into Mongol service. Their skills would soon become essential for future campaigns. The war with Western Xia lasted several years. Eventually, the kingdom accepted Mongol authority. Western Xia became a tributary state. Its rulers agreed to support Mongol campaigns with soldiers and resources. This victory achieved two important goals. First, it secured the southern border of Mongolia. Second, it prepared the Mongol army for larger conflicts ahead. Now, Genghis Khan was ready to confront the Jin dynasty itself. Relations between the Mongols and the Jin had been tense for many years. In earlier generations, the Jin rulers had attempted to control the tribes of the steppe. Sometimes they supported certain tribes against others. Sometimes they demanded tribute. Such policies often created resentment among the nomads. Genghis Khan remembered these earlier humiliations, but his motivations were also strategic. The Jin Empire possessed enormous wealth. Its cities contained vast supplies of grain, metal, and manufactured goods. If the Mongols could gain access to these resources, their power would expand dramatically. Around the year 1211, the Mongol army began moving south toward Jin territory. Tens of thousands of riders crossed the frontier. Dust clouds rose behind them as they advanced. The Jin generals initially underestimated the threat. Their empire was vast. Their population numbered in the millions. Their armies included large infantry forces and armored cavalry. But the Mongols possessed advantages the Jin commanders did not fully understand. Speed, flexibility, and the unified leadership of Genghis Khan. The first battles took place along the northern defenses of the Jin Empire. Mongol cavalry swept across the countryside. Supply lines were disrupted. Fortresses found themselves isolated. Many towns surrendered quickly rather than face destruction. As the Mongols pushed deeper into Jin territory, their confidence grew. The campaign would eventually lead them toward the great capital of Zhongdu, but that dramatic siege was still ahead. For now, the Mongol riders continued advancing through the northern provinces. Each victory spread new stories across Asia, stories of an army that moved like the wind. stories of a leader who commanded absolute loyalty, stories of a war that was slowly reshaping the balance of power in East Asia. The quiet riders of the steppe, once dismissed as wandering nomads, were becoming conquerors, and the great cities of northern China would soon face the full force of the Mongol war machine. As the Mongol riders continued their advance into the lands of northern China, the world around them began to change. The open grasslands slowly gave way to cultivated fields. Villages appeared beside rivers. Stone roads connected distant towns. And everywhere, there were signs of a civilization far older and more complex than the scattered tribes of the steppe. For the Mongols, these lands were both fascinating and unfamiliar. Most of them had grown up beneath wide skies, in camps that could move whenever the seasons changed. But here, the people lived behind walls. Cities stood in the same places for centuries. Granaries stored food for thousands of families. Markets sold goods from distant regions. To the Mongols, such places seemed almost endless in their wealth. And at the center of this prosperous world stood one of the greatest cities of the Jin dynasty, Zhongdu, the capital of northern China. Zhongdu was enormous by the standards of the time. Thick stone walls surrounded the city. Guard towers stood at regular intervals along the ramparts. Massive gates controlled entry from the surrounding countryside. Inside the walls, the city bustled with life. Merchants traded silk and grain. Craftsmen worked in crowded workshops. Imperial officials carried messages between government offices. For many people living within those walls, the Mongols were still little more than distant rumors. Stories of riders from the steppe. Stories of small raids along the frontier. Few believed that such nomads could threaten a city as powerful as Zhongdu, yet beyond the walls, and the Mongol army continued to move closer. After several successful campaigns across northern provinces, Genghis Khan directed his forces toward the capital. The Mongol riders did not attack the city immediately. Instead, they began by cutting the surrounding region away from it. Farms outside the walls were captured. Supply routes were disrupted. Caravans carrying grain and goods were intercepted. Slowly, Zhongdu began to feel the pressure of isolation. Inside the city, Jin officials debated how to respond. The empire still possessed large armies, but the Mongols moved quickly. Their cavalry appeared in one region, then disappeared and struck somewhere else. It became difficult to gather enough troops in a single place to challenge them. Meanwhile, the Mongols continued preparing for something they had once considered impossible: a siege. For generations, nomadic armies had avoided attacking large fortified cities. Walls were powerful defenses, and steppe warriors had little experience with siege warfare. But Genghis Khan had already begun solving that problem. Engineers captured during earlier campaigns now worked within the Mongol army. Many came from Chinese or Central Asian backgrounds. They knew how to construct machines designed for attacking walls. Under their guidance, the Mongols began building siege equipment: large catapults capable of launching stones, siege towers that allowed soldiers to approach the ramparts, battering devices used to break gates. These machines slowly appeared outside Zhongdu's defenses. The city that had once seemed untouchable now faced a new and unfamiliar threat. The siege lasted many months. During this time, the Mongol army maintained constant pressure. Cavalry patrols surrounded the region, supply caravans were intercepted, and siege engines bombarded the walls. Inside Zhongdu, life became increasingly difficult. Food supplies grew smaller. Prices in the markets rose sharply. Fear began spreading among the population. Many residents had never experienced war so close to home. Yet, despite these hardships, the defenders of the city continued resisting. The Jin dynasty still hoped that reinforcements would arrive, but the Mongol strategy had already weakened their ability to respond. Many Jin armies were scattered across distant provinces. Communication between commanders became slow and uncertain. Eventually, the pressure became too great. By the year 1215, the defenses of Zhongdu were failing. Parts of the city were set ablaze during the fighting. Smoke rose into the sky above the capital. The once magnificent center of Jin power had become a battlefield. When the city finally fell, the consequences were enormous. Zhongdu had been one of the greatest cities of northern China. Its capture sent shockwaves across the region. For the Mongols, the victory proved something remarkable. Nomadic riders from the steppe had defeated one of the largest fortified cities in Asia. Their army had adapted. Their strategy had worked, and their confidence grew even stronger. But Genghis Khan understood that the conquest of the Jin Empire was far from complete. The empire still controlled vast territories. Many cities remained unconquered, and the Mongol armies could not remain in one place for long. After the fall of Zhongdu, the Mongols withdrew temporarily from the city. Their attention soon turned elsewhere, because while the war in China continued, another opportunity was beginning to appear far to the west. Beyond deserts, beyond mountains, beyond the distant trade routes of Central Asia, a wealthy empire ruled lands filled with prosperous cities and busy markets. Its name was Khwarezmia, and in the years ahead, a single mistake made by that empire would unleash one of the most devastating campaigns in world history. The Mongol riders would soon leave China behind, and they would ride west. As the smoke above Zhongdu slowly drifted into the northern sky, the Mongol armies did not remain long within the captured city. The conquest of northern China had demonstrated something important. The Mongols could defeat powerful kingdoms. They could capture fortified cities, and they could adapt their tactics to unfamiliar kinds of warfare. Yet Genghis Khan was not interested in ruling every conquered land directly. The Mongols remained people of the steppe. Their strength depended on mobility, on speed, on the ability to move their armies across vast distances. So while some Mongol forces continued campaigns against the Jin dynasty, Genghis Khan began looking in another direction, to the west. Beyond the Mongolian steppe, beyond the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, lay a wealthy empire known as Khwarezmia. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched across much of modern-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Iran. Its cities were famous throughout the Islamic world. Places like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench stood along the great trade routes of the Silk Road. Caravans carrying silk, spices, metals, and precious stones passed through their markets. Scholars and merchants traveled between Persia, India, and China. Compared with the nomadic camps of Mongolia, these cities represented enormous prosperity. But Genghis Khan's first intention toward Khwarezmia was not war. He wanted trade. Trade between the Mongol lands and the cities of Central Asia could benefit both sides. The Mongols possessed horses, animal products, and access to eastern trade routes. Khwarezmia possessed wealthy markets and connections to the Islamic world. So, around the year 1218, Genghis Khan sent a large caravan of merchants westward. The caravan included many traders from different backgrounds. Some were Mongols. Others were Muslims who already had experience traveling along the Silk Road. Their mission was peaceful. They carried valuable goods and letters from the Mongol ruler. They hoped to establish commercial relations with the Khwarezmian Empire. The caravan eventually arrived at the city of Otrar. Otrar stood near the frontier of the empire. Its governor was a man named Inalchuk. When the merchants entered the city, they expected the usual customs of trade. but something went terribly wrong. Inalchuk became suspicious of the caravan. Some sources suggest he believed the merchants were spies. Others suggest greed may have played a role. Whatever the reason, the governor made a decision that would soon have enormous consequences. He ordered the caravan seized. The goods were confiscated, and the merchants themselves were arrested. News of the incident reached the court of the Khwarezmian ruler. The emperor of the empire was Shah Muhammad II. He governed a large and powerful state. His armies controlled many cities, and he had little reason to fear distant nomads from Mongolia. Instead of correcting the governor's actions, the Shah allowed the arrests to stand. Many members of the caravan were executed. Others died in prison. When word of this reached Genghis Khan, the Mongol ruler reacted with remarkable restraint. Rather than declaring immediate war, he chose diplomacy. Genghis Khan sent a delegation of ambassadors to Shah Muhammad. Their message was simple. The governor of Otrar had committed a serious crime. He had attacked merchants traveling under Mongol protection. Genghis Khan demanded justice. The governor responsible should be punished, and the Shah should restore peaceful relations between their two states. The ambassadors rode west across the deserts and mountains. Eventually, they arrived at the court of Shah Muhammad. The Khwarezmian ruler now faced a critical decision. He could apologize, he could punish the governor, or he could ignore the Mongol request. Unfortunately, the Shah chose a different path. He interpreted the Mongol message as weakness. Perhaps he believed the Mongols would not dare challenge his powerful empire. Perhaps he underestimated the determination of Genghis Khan. Whatever his reasoning, his response was disastrous. One of the Mongol ambassadors was executed. The others were humiliated and sent back east. According to many historical accounts, their beards were shaved before their return. In Mongol culture, this was a profound insult. The ambassadors eventually returned to Genghis Khan. They delivered the Shah's answer. The news spread quickly through the Mongol camps. For the warriors of the steppe, the killing of ambassadors was an unforgivable act. Envoys were traditionally protected under the laws of diplomacy. Even enemies respected their safety by executing one ambassador and insulting the others. Shah Muhammad had crossed a line. At first, Genghis Khan remained silent. He listened to the report, he considered the implications, and then, slowly, he made his decision. The Khwarezmian Empire would be punished, not with a simple raid, not with a limited campaign, but with a full invasion. The Mongol armies began preparing for one of the largest military expeditions in their history. Messengers rode across the steppe. Commanders gathered their forces. Horses were prepared for long journeys. The target was enormous. The Khwarezmian Empire covered vast territories and many fortified cities, but Genghis Khan had already demonstrated that no wall was beyond his reach. In the quiet months before the campaign began, the Mongol leader studied maps and reports. He listened to merchants who had traveled the trade routes. He learned the geography of deserts and rivers. When the Mongol armies finally began moving west, they did so with careful planning. Their riders crossed the steppe. They moved through mountain passes. They advanced toward the wealthy cities of Central Asia. The Shah of Khwarezmia still believed his empire was secure. He had armies, he had fortresses, and he controlled lands filled with millions of people. But the Mongol riders were already approaching, and soon the cities of the Silk Road would witness one of the most devastating campaigns in the history of warfare. As winter winds began to sweep across the plains of Central Asia, the armies of Genghis Khan moved steadily toward the Khwarezmian Empire. The campaign ahead would be unlike anything the Mongols had attempted before. The lands of Khwarezmia were vast. Its cities were strong. Its population was large. And its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, believed his empire could withstand any invasion. Yet the Mongols approached with patience and careful planning. Rather than marching as a single army, Genghis Khan divided his forces into several separate groups. Each army would travel along different routes. Some moved through mountain passes. Others crossed wide deserts. A few rode along the great rivers of Central Asia. To outside observers, these movements seemed confusing. But this was precisely the intention. The Mongols often used this strategy to create uncertainty among their enemies. If an army appeared suddenly from several directions at once, defenders could not easily predict where the main attack would come. Shah Muhammad faced a difficult problem. His empire contained many important cities: Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench. Each required protection, but his armies could not defend them all at the same time. Instead of concentrating his forces, the Shah chose to divide them. Large garrisons remained inside major cities. Other troops guarded trade routes and frontier regions. In theory, this strategy allowed every location to maintain its own defense. In practice, it made each city vulnerable to the fast-moving Mongol armies. In the year 1220, the first great target of the campaign appeared on the horizon: the city of Bukhara. Bukhara was one of the most famous cities along the Silk Road. Its mosques and schools were respected across the Islamic world. Merchants from many regions gathered in its markets. Scholars debated ideas in its courtyards. For generations, Bukhara had stood as a center of culture and trade. Few of its citizens expected the Mongol army to appear so suddenly. Yet one morning, dust clouds rose across the plains outside the city. Mongol riders were approaching. The defenders of Bukhara retreated behind their walls. The gates were closed. Archers prepared their weapons along the ramparts. But the Mongols had already learned how to deal with fortified cities. Engineers assembled siege machines. Archers surrounded the walls. Cavalry patrols prevented anyone from escaping. The siege did not last long. Part of the city's garrison eventually attempted to escape during the night. Their effort failed. Once the defenders were weakened, Mongol forces entered the city. Historical accounts describe the moment when Genghis Khan himself addressed the captured population. According to one famous story, he spoke to them inside a mosque. He reportedly told the people that their rulers had brought disaster upon them. Had the Khwarezmian Empire respected Mongol envoys, the war might never have begun. Whether the exact words are accurate or not, the message was clear. The invasion was presented as punishment for the Shah's actions. After the fall of Bukhara, the Mongol armies continued their advance. Their next target was even greater: the legendary city of Samarkand. Samarkand was one of the largest cities in Central Asia. Its walls were strong. Its garrison included tens of thousands of soldiers. Many of these soldiers were foreign mercenaries brought to defend the city. Shah Muhammad believed Samarkand would resist the Mongols successfully. Yet, once again, the Mongol strategy proved effective. Several Mongol armies converged on the city from different directions. Siege machines bombarded the walls. Archers attacked defenders along the ramparts. Some defenders attempted to resist fiercely. Others began to lose confidence as the days passed. Eventually, parts of the city surrendered. Once Samarkand fell, the psychological impact across the region was enormous. Two of the greatest cities of Central Asia had been defeated. The reputation of the Mongol armies spread rapidly. Many smaller towns surrendered without resistance. Others attempted to fight and were overwhelmed. Meanwhile, Shah Muhammad struggled to organize an effective defense. Instead of gathering his forces to confront the Mongols directly, he moved constantly from one region to another. His commanders often received unclear orders. Some armies retreated before battles even began. The unity of the Khwarezmian Empire began to collapse, and the Mongol campaign continued moving forward. Cities that had stood proudly along the Silk Road now faced destruction. Trade routes were disrupted. Refugees fled across the countryside. Caravans disappeared from the desert roads. The great network of commerce that once connected Asia began to fracture. Yet the Mongol armies did not slow down. Their riders crossed rivers. They advanced through valleys. They pushed deeper into the heart of the empire. For Genghis Khan, this campaign was not only about victory, it was about demonstrating the consequences of defying Mongol authority. And in the next stage of the invasion, two of his most brilliant generals would undertake a journey that would carry Mongol riders farther west than ever before, across the Caucasus Mountains and into the distant lands of Eastern Europe. After the fall of the great cities of Central Asia, the Mongol campaign did not immediately come to an end. Much of the Khwarezmian Empire had collapsed. Its once powerful ruler, Shah Muhammad II, was now fleeing across his own lands. Cities that had once been proud centers of trade now stood damaged or abandoned. Caravans disappeared from the Silk Road. Merchants hid their goods. And throughout the region, stories spread about the unstoppable riders from the east. Yet Genghis Khan was not finished. While some Mongol armies remained in Central Asia to secure the conquered territories, two of his most trusted generals were given a different task. Their mission was not simply conquest, it was exploration, to travel west, to learn about the lands beyond the Mongol frontier, and to discover what kingdoms and armies might one day stand in the path of the Mongol Empire. The two commanders chosen for this mission were among the most capable leaders in the Mongol army. One was Jebi, a general known for his boldness and tactical creativity. The other was Subutai, a brilliant strategist whose understanding of long-distance warfare would eventually make him one of the greatest military commanders in history. Together, they were given command of a mobile force of Mongol cavalry. Their army was not enormous by the standards of the Mongol Empire, but it was fast, experienced, and capable of surviving long campaigns far from home. In the early 1220s, their riders began moving westward across unfamiliar lands. They crossed deserts. They followed rivers through narrow valleys. They rode across territories that few Mongols had ever seen before. The journey itself was remarkable. For thousands of kilometers, the army traveled through regions filled with different cultures and languages. Turkic tribes, Persian cities, mountain communities scattered across remote valleys, and some groups resisted the Mongols. Others chose negotiation, and some simply watched the riders pass through their lands like a sudden storm. Eventually, the Mongol army approached one of the most formidable natural barriers in the region, the Caucasus Mountains. These mountains formed a vast wall between the lands of Central Asia and the regions surrounding the Black Sea. Snow-covered peaks rose high above narrow passes. Travel through these mountains could be extremely difficult. But Subutai and Jebi were not easily discouraged. Instead of attempting to cross the mountains directly with a large army, they used a strategy that had often served the Mongols well. They sought alliances. Some of the local tribes living near the Caucasus had long-standing conflicts with neighboring peoples. The Mongol generals negotiated with these groups. They promised cooperation, and in return they gained safe passage through certain mountain routes. Slowly, carefully, the Mongol riders passed through the Caucasus. On the western side of the mountains, a new world opened before them. Wide grasslands once again stretched toward the horizon, but these plains belonged to different peoples. Turkic nomads, known as the Kipchaks, roamed these territories. Farther north and west, powerful principalities of the Kievan Rus controlled cities along great rivers. These lands formed part of the eastern frontier of Europe. At first, the Mongols did not immediately launch large attacks. Their mission remained reconnaissance. They observed. They tested the strength of local forces. They gathered information about terrain and armies, but conflict soon became unavoidable. The Kipchaks, alarmed by the appearance of the Mongol riders, sought help from the Rus princes. Together, they formed an alliance to confront the invading army. For the Mongol generals, this presented both danger and opportunity. Their forces were smaller than the combined armies now gathering against them. But Mongol commanders had faced similar situations before. They relied on strategy rather than numbers. In the year 1223, the two armies finally met near the Kalka River. The battle that followed became one of the most famous examples of Mongol battlefield tactics. At first, the Mongol riders appeared to retreat. They withdrew across the plains. Their horses carried them farther and farther away from the pursuing enemy. The Rus and Kipchak forces believed the Mongols were fleeing. Confident in their advantage, they chased them. But the retreat was carefully planned. For days, the Mongols continued pulling their enemies deeper into unfamiliar territory. The Allied army stretched out across the landscape. Units became separated from one another. Communication between commanders weakened. Then, at the moment chosen by Subutai and Jabe, the Mongol army turned. Fresh units appeared from hidden positions. The pursuing army suddenly found itself facing a coordinated counterattack. Mounted archers circled the battlefield. Arrows rained down. Confusion spread through the Rus and Kipchak ranks. The battle ended in a decisive Mongol victory. By several Rus princes were captured. Others fled the battlefield. For the first time, the warriors of Eastern Europe had encountered the military power of the Mongol Empire. Yet despite their victory, Subutai and Jabe did not remain in the region. Their mission had been reconnaissance, and they had learned what they needed. They had seen the lands of the Western Steppe. They had tested the strength of European armies. They had proven that Mongol riders could travel extraordinary distances across unfamiliar continents. Soon after the battle, their forces turned east once again. They rode back across the steppes, through the mountain passes, and toward the lands controlled by Genghis Khan. The journey had taken years, and the knowledge they carried would prove invaluable, because in the decades that followed, the Mongol Empire would return to these lands. But the next time, it would not be a reconnaissance mission. It would be a full invasion. As the Mongol generals Subutai and Jabe rode back east across the vast grasslands, the empire they returned to was larger than ever before. From the deserts of Central Asia to the northern provinces of China, the authority of Genghis Khan now stretched across enormous distances. Yet the Mongol ruler himself had not slowed down. Even after decades of warfare, he remained active in planning new campaigns. The unity of the Mongol tribes had created a powerful force, and Genghis Khan believed that strength must continue moving forward, because on the steppe, power that stands still rarely survives for long. Among the kingdoms that still resisted Mongol authority was Western Xia. Years earlier, Western Xia had accepted Mongol dominance after several campaigns. Its rulers had agreed to provide tribute and military support. But as the Mongol armies turned westward toward Khwarezmia, Western Xia had grown uncertain. Its leaders hesitated to assist the Mongol campaigns. Some sources suggest they even refused to send troops when requested. To Genghis Khan, this was not a small matter. The Mongol system depended heavily on loyalty and obedience. A vassal state that failed to honor its obligations threatened the stability of the entire empire. So, in the year 1226, Genghis Khan launched what would become his final campaign. The target, once again, was Western Xia. the Mongol armies moved across deserts and mountain valleys toward the cities of the kingdom. Many towns fell quickly. The Mongol war machine had only grown stronger over the years. Commanders were experienced, siege engineers were skilled, and the reputation of the Mongols often frightened defenders into surrender before battles even began. City after city submitted to Mongol control. The rulers of Western Xia attempted to negotiate, but Genghis Khan had already decided that this campaign would end their independence completely. The Mongol armies continued their advance, and gradually, the remaining resistance of the kingdom began to collapse. During this long campaign, Genghis Khan was already an aging man. He had spent much of his life riding across battlefields and deserts. Now, in his mid-60s, the years of warfare were beginning to weigh on him. Historical records do not agree on the exact circumstances of his death. Some accounts suggest he was injured during a hunting accident. Others claim he was wounded during the fighting against Western Xia. A few stories even suggest illness may have played a role. The truth remains uncertain. What is known is that during the campaign of 1227, Genghis Khan died. The man who had once been the struggling boy Temujin, abandoned by his tribe on the Mongolian steppe, had lived long enough to create the largest land empire the world had yet seen. Yet, even in death, his plans continued to shape the Mongol world. Before he died, Genghis Khan had already arranged the future leadership of his empire. His sons had grown into experienced commanders. Among them, his third son Ogedei had been chosen as the next great Khan. This decision would later be confirmed by a Kurultai gathering of the Mongol nobility. After Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol armies continued the campaign against Western Xia. The kingdom's final resistance collapsed. Its cities were absorbed into the growing Mongol Empire. Yet the death of their founder remained a deeply significant moment. According to Mongol tradition, the burial of Genghis Khan was carried out in secrecy. His body was transported back toward Mongolia. The exact location of his tomb remains unknown even today. Legends tell of soldiers guarding the funeral procession. Some stories claim that those who witnessed the burial site were sworn to silence. Other accounts describe elaborate efforts to conceal the grave completely. Whatever the truth may be, the resting place of Genghis Khan has never been definitively discovered. Across the Mongolian steppe, life slowly continued. The winds still moved through the grass. Horses still grazed across the plains. Nomadic families continued traveling with the seasons. Yet the world had changed. The Mongol tribes were now part of a vast empire. And although its founder had passed away, the system he created remained strong. His commanders were experienced. His military organization remained intact, and the ambition of the Mongol leadership had not faded. In fact, the next generation of Mongol rulers would soon push the empire even farther. Under the leadership of Ogedei Khan, Mongol armies would ride west once again. This time, they would not stop at the frontiers of Eastern Europe. They would cross rivers, burn cities, and send shockwaves through the kingdoms of the medieval world. The thunder of Mongol horses was only beginning. The winds of the Mongolian steppe continued to move quietly across the grasslands, just as they had long before the rise of Genghis Khan. Yet the empire he created did not fade with his passing. Instead, it entered a new chapter. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, the Mongol leadership followed the traditions of the steppe. A new ruler would not be chosen immediately. Instead, the empire was governed temporarily by trusted members of the royal family, while preparations were made for another great council. A Kurultai. Leaders of the Mongol tribes would gather once again. They would discuss the future. and they would confirm the successor chosen by the founder himself. Several years later, the assembly took place. Commanders, nobles, and tribal representatives traveled from distant corners of the expanding empire. They arrived from Mongolia, from northern China, from Central Asia. All of them came to participate in one of the most important decisions in Mongol history. At the Kurultai, Genghis Khan's third son was formally recognized as the new Great Khan. His name was Ögedei Khan. Ögedei had grown up during the years when his father was still uniting the Mongol tribes. He had fought in many campaigns. He had learned the discipline of the Mongol military system, and he had gained the respect of many commanders. Unlike his father, Ögedei was known for a more relaxed personality. He enjoyed gatherings and celebrations, but he also understood the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. The empire he inherited was already enormous, yet many of its regions were still unstable, and the Mongol leadership had no intention of stopping their expansion. One of Ögedei's first major decisions was to establish a more permanent administrative center for the empire. Until this time, the Mongol rulers had largely governed from mobile camps, but as the empire grew larger, coordination across distant regions became more difficult. So Ögedei ordered the construction of a new capital city. This city would stand in the heart of Mongolia, near the old homeland of the Mongol tribes. The city was called Karakorum. Karakorum was not as large as the ancient cities of China or Persia, but for the Mongol Empire, it represented an important step toward the centralized rule. Artisans and builders from many conquered regions were brought to the site. Workshops appeared, markets formed. Diplomats from distant lands eventually visited its gates. The city became a meeting point for the many cultures now connected by Mongol power. While Karakorum grew, Ögedei and his generals also prepared for new campaigns. The Mongol leadership believed that continued expansion would strengthen the empire. Conquered territories provided resources, they provided tribute, and they discouraged rebellion by demonstrating Mongol strength. One of the most important strategic goals lay far to the west, beyond the lands explored earlier by Subutai and Jebe, the vast regions controlled by the princes of the Rus. These territories stretched across forests, rivers, and open plains. Cities such as Kiev, Vladimir, and Ryazan served as centers of trade and regional authority. Although the Rus principalities were powerful within their own lands, they were often divided by rivalry. Different princes competed for influence. Alliances shifted frequently. From the Mongol perspective, this division presented an opportunity. If the Rus princes could not unite, their lands might be conquered one by one. To lead the Western campaigns, Ögedei turned to one of the most experienced commanders of the Mongol army, the same general who had earlier explored the Western steppe, Subutai. By now, Subutai had spent decades studying warfare across many different regions. He understood the importance of long-distance planning. He knew how to coordinate multiple armies across vast territories, and he believed that the lands of Eastern Europe could be reached through careful preparation. The campaign would not be a simple raid. It would be a full invasion. In the late 1230s, the Mongol war machine began gathering once again. Armies assembled from across the empire. Riders came from Mongolia, from Central Asia, from the newly conquered territories of China. Each army was organized according to the familiar decimal structure: Arban, Zun, Mingan, Tumen. Thousands of horses grazed across the steppe as preparations continued. Supplies were gathered. Messengers traveled between commanders. And slowly, the great army began moving west. The first targets were the frontier cities of the Rus principalities. In the winter of 1237, the Mongol riders reached the land surrounding the city of Ryazan. The inhabitants of the city watched as dust clouds appeared on the horizon. The stories they had heard about the Mongols now became reality. Soon, the armies of the steppe stood before their walls. For the kingdoms of Eastern Europe, a new and terrifying chapter of history was about to begin. Because the Mongol invasion of the Rus lands would become one of the most devastating campaigns of the medieval world, and the riders of the steppe were only just arriving. Winter had already settled across the forests and plains of Eastern Europe when the Mongol armies approached the lands of the Rus. Snow covered the roads. Rivers froze into long white corridors across the countryside. For many medieval armies, winter was a season of rest, a time when campaigns slowed or stopped entirely. But the Mongol riders were different. They had grown up in the harsh climates of the steppe. Their horses were accustomed to digging through snow to find grass. Cold winds and frozen rivers did not slow them. In many ways, winter actually made their movement easier. The frozen rivers acted like natural roads. They allowed cavalry to travel quickly across territories that would normally be difficult to cross. And so, in the winter of 1237, the Mongol armies rode west under the command of Subutai and the prince Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan. Their first great target was the city of Ryazan. Ryazan stood as an important fortress of the Rus principalities. Its wooden walls protected a community of merchants, craftsmen, and warriors. When the Mongol envoys arrived outside the city, they delivered a simple message. The city should surrender and pay tribute. If it did so, its people might be spared. But the princes of Ryazan refused. The Mongol envoys were dismissed, and the defenders prepared for war. Soon after, the Mongol army surrounded the city. Siege engines were assembled. Archers took positions, and the quiet winter air filled with the sounds of preparation. The siege did not last long. The Mongol war machine had already mastered the art of attacking fortified cities. Their engineers knew how to weaken walls. Their archers maintained constant pressure on defenders, and their cavalry prevented any help from reaching the city. After several days of fighting, Ryazan fell. The destruction that followed became legendary in the chronicles of the Rus. Large portions of the city were burned. Many of its defenders were killed. Survivors fled into the surrounding forests. The fall of Ryazan sent shockwaves through the neighboring principalities. Messengers rushed to other cities carrying urgent warnings. The Mongols were not a small raiding party. They were an organized invasion force, and they were moving quickly. From Ryazan, the Mongol armies continued westward. City after city faced the same terrible choice: surrender and submit, or resist and face destruction. Many chose to resist. The next major target was Vladimir. Vladimir served as one of the most important political centers of the Rus lands. Its prince attempted to gather forces from neighboring regions. But the Mongols moved faster than the defenders expected. In early 1238, their army arrived outside the city. The siege that followed was intense but brief. Once again, siege machines bombarded the walls. Archers attacked defenders from multiple directions, and eventually, the Mongols broke through. Vladimir fell. Its churches and buildings were consumed by fire. The princes of the Rus lands realized that their world was changing rapidly, but their efforts to unite came too late. The Mongols continued advancing through forests and across frozen rivers. Smaller towns and fortresses fell one after another. Some cities surrendered, others resisted bravely, but the Mongol army remained relentless. Perhaps the most famous moment of this campaign came 2 years later, when the Mongol forces approached the great city of Kiev. Kiev had once been the heart of the Kievan Rus civilization. Its churches and monasteries were famous across Eastern Europe. Its markets connected northern trade routes with the Black Sea. But by the time the Mongols arrived in 1240, the city was already weakened by years of political division. Its defenders fought fiercely. The walls were strong. The siege lasted several weeks. Yet the outcome was ultimately the same. Mongol engineers constructed powerful siege machines. Their archers maintained constant pressure. And eventually, the city's defenses collapsed. When Kiev fell, it marked the end of an era for the Rus lands. The Mongol armies had destroyed or weakened many of the major centers of the region. From the Volga River to the Dnieper, the political landscape of Eastern Europe had been transformed. In the years that followed, the Mongols established control over these territories through a system of tribute and local governance. The Rus princes were allowed to rule their lands, but they did so under Mongol authority. Tribute payments flowed eastward. Envoys traveled regularly between Rus cities and the Mongol court. This new political order would later become known as the rule of the Golden Horde. For many generations, the influence of the Mongol Empire would shape the development of Russia and its neighboring regions. Yet the Mongol armies did not stop their advance at Kiev. Subutai and Batu Khan had even greater ambitions. Beyond the forests of the Rus lands, farther west, lay the kingdoms of Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, and the distant lands of the Holy Roman Empire. Soon, the riders of the steppe would bring the Mongol war machine into the very heart of medieval Europe. As the Mongol armies continued their advance across the lands of the Rus, the western horizon slowly revealed new territories. Beyond the forests and frozen rivers, beyond the cities that had once belonged to the princes of Kiev, lay the kingdoms of Central Europe. These lands were very different from the steppe. Stone castles stood on hilltops. Fields were divided into carefully cultivated farms. Church towers rose above towns and villages. Knights in heavy armor served their kings and nobles. For many people living in Europe during the 13th century, the Mongols were still almost unknown. Some travelers had heard rumors, stories of distant riders from Asia, stories of cities destroyed along the Silk Road. But few truly understood the scale of the empire now expanding toward them. Meanwhile, the Mongol commanders were preparing carefully. The invasion of Europe was not a sudden decision. It was part of a larger strategy. Subutai and Batu Khan divided their forces into several separate armies. Each army would move along a different route. One column advanced through Poland. Another moved toward Hungary. Additional units secured the territories already conquered in the Rus lands. This approach created confusion among European rulers. Reports arrived from different directions. Some spoke of Mongol riders in the north. Others described battles farther south. Many kings and princes struggled to understand the full scope of the threat. One of the first major confrontations took place in Poland. In the spring of 1241, Mongol forces encountered an army led by Henry II, the Duke of Silesia. European knights gathered under his command. They hoped to stop the Mongol advance before it could spread deeper into the region. The armies met near the town of Legnica. The battle that followed revealed the stark differences between the two military systems. The European knights fought with courage. Clad in heavy armor, they charged across the battlefield with lances and swords, but the Mongols relied on mobility and coordination. Mounted archers circled the field. Arrows fell in steady waves. Dust and smoke filled the air. At one moment during the battle, the Mongols used a tactic that confused their enemies. They released clouds of smoke or burning material, creating a thick haze across the battlefield. The European forces struggled to see clearly. Signals between units became difficult, and as the confusion spread, the Mongol cavalry launched coordinated attacks from several directions. The result was decisive. the European army was defeated. Duke Henry II himself was killed during the battle. The victory at Legnica opened the path deeper into Central Europe, but the main Mongol campaign was unfolding farther south. There, another Mongol army advanced into the Kingdom of Hungary. Hungary was ruled by King Bela IV. When news of the Mongol invasion reached him, he attempted to gather a large army to defend his kingdom. Hungarian knights joined the royal forces, and soldiers from neighboring regions arrived as well. The army gathered near the Sejo River. In April 1241, the Mongol army led by Batu Khan and Subutai approached the Hungarian camp. The battlefield that followed is remembered as the Battle of Mohi. Once again, the Mongol strategy combined speed, coordination, and deception. During the night, Mongol units secretly crossed the river at different points. Engineers constructed temporary bridges. By morning, the Hungarian army found itself under attack from several directions. Archers fired into the crowded camp. Cavalry units broke through defensive lines. The Hungarian army fought fiercely, but the Mongol tactics proved overwhelming. By the end of the battle, the Hungarian forces were defeated. Large portions of the kingdom lay open to Mongol control. Cities and towns across Hungary suffered heavy damage during the following months. Across Europe, fear began spreading rapidly. Stories of the Mongol victories traveled from one court to another. Kings wondered whether their own kingdoms might soon face the same fate. The Mongol armies had already reached the borders of Austria. Some observers believed they might soon advance toward Vienna. If that happened, the heart of Europe itself could be threatened. Yet at this moment, when the Mongol advance seemed unstoppable, an unexpected event occurred far away in the east. News arrived from the Mongol homeland. The great Khan, Ögedei Khan, had died. According to Mongol tradition, the death of the great Khan required the leading princes of the empire to return east. A new Kurultai would be held to choose the next ruler. And so, in the midst of their victories in Europe, the Mongol armies began preparing to withdraw. The thunder of their horses faded from the European plains, but the memory of their invasion would remain for generations. Across the plains of Central Europe, the winter of 1241 slowly gave way to spring. The Mongol armies had already defeated several powerful kingdoms. Polish forces had fallen at Legnica. Hungarian armies had been shattered at the Battle of Mohi. Cities burned, villages emptied, and throughout Europe, rumors spread about the unstoppable riders from the east. Messengers traveled between royal courts carrying urgent warnings. Kings and nobles listened with growing concern. Some feared that the Mongol armies might soon push deeper into the continent. Austria stood vulnerable. The lands of the Holy Roman Empire lay beyond, and many wondered whether the great cities of Western Europe might eventually face the same fate as the towns of Hungary. Yet, far away, thousands of kilometers to the east, an event had occurred that would change everything. In the winter of 1241, the great Khan Ögedei had died. His death took place in Mongolia, far from the battlefields of Europe. But within the Mongol Empire, such an event carried enormous importance. According to Mongol political tradition, the death of a great Khan required the ruling princes of the empire to return for a new Kurultai. At this council, a successor would be chosen. The decision could not be made without the participation of the leading members of the royal family. This meant that many of the most powerful Mongol commanders were expected to travel back toward the eastern homeland. When news of Ögedei's death reached the western Mongol armies, the situation suddenly became complicated. The invasion of Europe had been successful. The Mongol forces still held the advantage. Many historians believe they could have continued advancing farther west, but the political traditions of the empire could not be ignored. Batu Khan, the Mongol prince leading the European campaign, faced an important decision. Should the invasion continue, or should the army return east to participate in the succession of the next great Khan? In the end, tradition prevailed. The Mongol leadership began preparing to withdraw from Central Europe. The movement did not happen instantly. Armies needed time to regroup. Supplies needed to be organized. But slowly, the Mongol riders began turning back toward the east. For the kingdoms of Europe, this sudden change was almost unbelievable. Just months earlier, their armies had been collapsing. Now, the invading forces were leaving. To many European observers, and it seemed like a miracle. Some chroniclers even interpreted the Mongol withdrawal as divine intervention. In reality, the explanation was far more political. The structure of the Mongol Empire required unity among its ruling family. Without a recognized great Khan, major decisions about new campaigns could not easily be made. And so, while the Mongol armies slowly withdrew from Hungary and neighboring regions, the political future of the empire was being debated far away in Asia. Yet, even though the Mongols left Central Europe, their presence in the eastern regions of the continent did not disappear. The territories of the Ruslands remained under Mongol authority. The Mongol rulers established a powerful state known as the Golden Horde. This state controlled the vast steppes north of the Black Sea. From this base, Mongol leaders governed the Rus principalities. Local princes were allowed to remain in power, but they ruled under Mongol supervision. Tribute payments were collected regularly. Envoys traveled between the Rus cities and the Mongol courts. For more than 2 centuries, this political arrangement would shape the development of Eastern Europe. Many historians later referred to this period as the Mongol yoke. Yet, even during this time, trade continued across the steppe. Caravans moved between Asia and Europe. Diplomats and travelers crossed the vast territories controlled by Mongol rulers. In some ways, the Mongol presence even strengthened long-distance connections between distant regions. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe slowly recovered from the shock of the invasion. Cities were rebuilt, armies reorganized. Kings attempted to understand the new balance of power beyond their eastern borders. The Mongol Empire still existed, and although its armies had withdrawn for the moment, everyone knew that the riders of the steppe might return. But history would take a different direction, because in the decades that followed, the Mongol Empire itself began changing. New rulers would emerge. Different regions of the empire would grow more independent, and the unified power created by Genghis Khan would gradually divide into separate Mongol states. Yet the memory of the Mongol invasion remained powerful. Across the plains of Europe, people would remember the year when riders from the distant steppe had appeared suddenly on the horizon, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the entire continent might fall beneath the thunder of Mongol horses. As the Mongol armies withdrew from the plains of Europe, the vast empire created by Genghis Khan continued expanding in other directions. Across the immense territories stretching from China to the Black Sea, different Mongol princes governed distant regions. Each commanded armies. Each ruled lands filled with many different cultures and peoples. Yet, despite this diversity, they all remained connected through the authority of the Great Khan. In the middle of the 13th century, the leadership of the empire passed to a new generation. One of the most powerful figures among them was Mongol Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan. When Mongol became Great Khan in 1251, he sought to strengthen Mongol control across all parts of the empire. His strategy involved launching major campaigns in several directions at once. To the east, his brother Kublai Khan would continue expanding Mongol power in China. And to the southwest, another brother would lead an army toward the Middle East. This commander was Hulagu Khan. Hulagu received a clear mission from the Great Khan. He was to secure Mongol control over the lands of Persia and Mesopotamia. Several powerful states existed in this region. Some had already acknowledged Mongol authority. Others resisted. Hulagu's task was to bring the entire region under Mongol influence. To accomplish this, he gathered one of the largest Mongol armies assembled since the time of Genghis Khan. Warriors arrived from across the empire: Mongol cavalry, allied troops from Central Asia, and engineers skilled in siege warfare. As Hulagu's army advanced westward, many cities surrendered without resistance. They had heard the stories of Mongol campaigns. They knew what had happened to cities that refused. But one city remained especially important: the ancient capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad. For centuries, Baghdad had been one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world. Founded in the 8th century, it had once stood as the center of a vast empire. Its scholars studied science, mathematics, and philosophy. Its libraries contained enormous collections of knowledge. Its markets connected trade routes stretching across Asia and Africa. Although the political power of the Abbasid Caliphate had declined over time, the city still carried immense symbolic importance. The Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, remained the spiritual leader of many Muslims. When Hulagu approached the region in 1258, he sent messages to the Caliph. Like many Mongol commanders before him, he offered a choice: submit peacefully to Mongol authority, or face the consequences of resistance. The Caliph hesitated. Some advisors urged negotiation. Others believed the city's defenses would protect them. Baghdad possessed strong walls and a large population, and many believed the Mongols would hesitate to attack such a sacred center of the Islamic world. But Hulagu was determined to complete his mission. When negotiations failed, the Mongol army surrounded the city. Siege machines were assembled. Engineers prepared catapults and other devices designed to break walls. The siege began. For several days, stones and projectiles struck the defenses of Baghdad. The Mongol forces gradually weakened the city's fortifications. Meanwhile, their cavalry controlled the surrounding countryside. No reinforcements could reach the city. Food supplies quickly became limited. Inside Baghdad, panic spread among the population. The Caliph eventually realized the situation was hopeless. He attempted to negotiate surrender, but by then, Hulagu had already decided the city's fate. When the Mongol forces entered Baghdad, the consequences were devastating. Large sections of the city were destroyed. Fires burned across neighborhoods. Many residents were killed or displaced. Historical sources describe enormous destruction. Although numbers recorded by medieval chroniclers may be exaggerated, there is little doubt that the fall of Baghdad was catastrophic. One of the most famous stories from this event involves the city's great libraries. Some accounts claim that so many books were thrown into the Tigris River that the water turned dark with ink. Whether entirely accurate or partly symbolic, the story reflects the scale of cultural loss experienced during the conquest. The Abbasid Caliphate itself came to an end. The Caliph al-Mustasim was captured and later killed. With his death, an institution that had existed for more than 500 years disappeared. For the Islamic world, the fall of Baghdad was a profound shock. Many people struggled to understand how such an ancient and respected city could fall so quickly. Yet, for the Mongol Empire, the conquest strengthened their influence across the Middle East. Hulagu established a new Mongol state in the region. This state would later become known as the Ilkhanate. From Persia to Mesopotamia, Mongol rulers now governed lands filled with ancient cultures and traditions. But even as the Mongol Empire reached its greatest geographic extent, the unity created by Genghis Khan was beginning to change. Different regions of the empire were gradually developing their own political identities, and in the years ahead, These differences would slowly reshape the future of the Mongol world. After the fall of Baghdad in 1258, the Mongol armies appeared almost unstoppable. Cities across Persia and Mesopotamia had fallen. Ancient institutions had collapsed, and the reputation of the Mongol war machine had spread across continents. Many rulers across the Middle East watched events with growing concern. Some chose to submit peacefully to Mongol authority. Others waited cautiously, uncertain whether resistance was even possible. But beyond the deserts of Syria and Palestine, another powerful force was rising: the Mamluks of Egypt. The Mamluks were a unique military elite. Many of them had once been slave soldiers, young men brought from the steppes of Central Asia or the Caucasus, trained from childhood in horsemanship and warfare. Over time, these soldiers had risen to power within Egypt. By the mid-13th century, they controlled the government and commanded a strong army. Their leaders were experienced commanders. Their cavalry was disciplined, and unlike many rulers who had faced the Mongols, the Mamluks had studied the tactics of the steppe. In the years following the conquest of Baghdad, Hulagu Khan pushed his armies farther west. Cities in Syria began to fall. Aleppo was captured. Damascus soon followed. The Mongol presence now extended deep into the eastern Mediterranean region. But events inside the Mongol Empire were once again influencing the direction of the campaign. In 1259, news arrived that the great Khan Munka had died. As had happened earlier in Mongol history, important princes were expected to participate in discussions about the next leader. Because of this, Hulagu withdrew a large portion of his army eastward. Only a smaller Mongol force remained in Syria under the command of a general named Kitbuka. Kitbuka was an experienced and respected commander, but the reduction of Mongol forces created a rare opportunity. The Mamluk leaders in Egypt recognized the moment. Their ruler, Sultan Qutuz, began gathering an army. He was joined by another talented commander, Baibars. Together, they prepared to confront the Mongol army before it could strengthen its position. In 1260, the two forces approached each other in the region of northern Palestine. The battlefield lay near a place called Ain Jalut. The location itself was a narrow valley surrounded by hills and farmland. For the Mamluk commanders, this terrain offered an advantage. They understood Mongol tactics. They knew the Mongols preferred open spaces where their cavalry could maneuver freely. But the valley of Ain Jalut limited that mobility. As the two armies prepared for battle, both sides understood the significance of the moment. For decades, the Mongol armies had defeated nearly every opponent they encountered. From China to Eastern Europe, their victories had reshaped the map of Eurasia. Now, for the first time, another army believed it could stop them. The battle began with movements familiar to Mongol warfare. Mamluk forces advanced cautiously. Mongol archers attacked from horseback. Arrows filled the air. Dust rose across the valley floor. At one stage, Baibars used a tactic similar to the Mongol feigned retreat. His cavalry appeared to withdraw from the battlefield. The Mongol forces pursued, but the retreat was carefully planned. As the Mongols advanced deeper into the valley, hidden Mamluk units emerged from surrounding hills. The Mongol army suddenly found itself under attack from multiple directions. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Both sides fought with determination. Kitbuka refused to retreat. According to historical accounts, he continued fighting even as the situation became desperate. Eventually, the Mongol lines broke. Kitbuka was captured during the battle. He was later executed. The Mongol army was defeated. The outcome of the Battle of Ain Jalut was extraordinary. For the first time in many decades, a major Mongol force had been stopped in open battle. The victory gave the Mamluks control over Syria. It also prevented the Mongol Empire from expanding further into Egypt and North Africa. News of the battle spread quickly across the Middle East. For many people, it was a sign that the Mongols were not invincible, that even the most powerful empire could face limits. Yet, the Mongol Empire itself remained enormous. Its armies still controlled vast territories across Asia, and its rulers continued governing regions filled with many cultures and traditions. But the unity that once held the empire together was gradually beginning to weaken. Different branches of the Mongol royal family ruled different territories. The Golden Horde dominated the western steppes. The Ilkhanate governed Persia and the Middle East. The Yuan dynasty would soon rule China. Each region developed its own interests and priorities. And slowly, the single empire created by Genghis Khan was transforming into several powerful Mongol states. The age of expansion was beginning to slow, but the influence of the Mongol world would continue shaping the history of Eurasia for generations, while Mongol armies clashed with the Mamluks in the Middle East. Another frontier of the Mongol world was forming far to the south. Beyond the towering mountains of the Himalayas, beyond the great rivers of the Indus and the Ganges, lay the rich and complex civilizations of the Indian subcontinent. For centuries, India had been home to powerful kingdoms, thriving cities, and vibrant trade networks. Caravans traveled between Central Asia and the northern plains of India. Merchants carried silk, spices, horses, and precious stones along ancient routes. These connections meant that the Mongol Empire could not ignore the region forever. The Mongol forces responsible for this frontier were primarily connected to the Chagatai Khanate. This branch of the Mongol royal family controlled much of Central Asia. From their territories, raids and expeditions occasionally moved south toward India. But the Indian subcontinent presented challenges very different from the open steppe. The climate was warmer. The terrain included rivers, forests, and dense settlements. And perhaps most importantly, northern India was defended by a powerful state, the Delhi Sultanate. By the late 13th century, the Delhi Sultanate had become one of the strongest kingdoms in the region. Its capital city, Delhi, stood as a major center of political authority and economic activity. Markets bustled with traders. Fortresses guarded important routes, and the sultans commanded large armies of cavalry and infantry. In 1299, a major Mongol army crossed the frontiers of the Delhi Sultanate. The Mongol force was led by Kutlugh Khwaja, a prince connected to the Chagatai Khanate. Their objective was ambitious. If successful, the Mongols might capture Delhi itself. Such a victory would open vast territories of the Indian subcontinent to Mongol influence. When news of the invasion reached the Sultan of Delhi, he responded quickly. The ruler at that time was Alauddin Khalji. Alauddin was known as a determined and capable leader. He understood the reputation of the Mongol armies. Stories of their conquests had reached India many times, but Alauddin believed the Mongols could be resisted. Instead of retreating behind the walls of Delhi, he chose to confront the invaders in open battle. His army assembled outside the capital. Among his commanders was a courageous general named Zafar Khan. Zafar Khan had already gained a reputation for bravery and skill in earlier conflicts. As the Mongol army approached, the two forces eventually met near a place called Kili. The battlefield lay on the plains not far from Delhi. For both armies, the coming confrontation carried enormous importance. If the Mongols won, the road to Delhi would lie open. If the Delhi Sultanate succeeded in stopping them, it would prove that Mongol expansion had limits. The battle began with movements typical of Mongol warfare. Mounted archers advanced. Arrows filled the air. Dust rose across the open ground as cavalry maneuvered for position. Zafar Khan saw an opportunity to strike, leading a bold charge. He attacked a portion of the Mongol army. His cavalry fought fiercely. For a time, it seemed that the Delhi forces might break the Mongol lines. But the Mongols responded with one of their most famous tactics. They began a feigned retreat. The Mongol riders appeared to withdraw across the battlefield. Zafar Khan pursued them aggressively. His forces rode forward with determination. But the retreat was deceptive. The Mongol units had drawn him away from the main army. Soon, additional Mongol forces surrounded the Delhi cavalry. Zafar Khan found himself trapped in a dangerous position. The fighting became intense and chaotic. Although Zafar Khan and his men fought bravely, they were eventually overwhelmed. The general himself was killed during the battle. Despite this loss, the Mongol army did not achieve its ultimate objective. The Delhi Sultanate remained strong. The main forces of Alauddin Khalji still stood ready to defend the capital. Kutlug Khwaja himself was wounded during the campaign. As the situation grew uncertain, the Mongol army eventually withdrew. For the Delhi Sultanate, the battle carried great significance. Although the loss of Zafar Khan was deeply felt, the Mongol invasion had been halted. Delhi remained unconquered, and the Indian subcontinent avoided becoming part of the Mongol Empire. In the years that followed, Alauddin Khalji strengthened the defenses of his kingdom. New fortifications were built, armies were reorganized. The Sultan understood that Mongol raids might return. Yet, despite occasional future incursions, the Mongols never succeeded in conquering northern India. The Battle of Kili therefore stands as an important moment in the history of Mongol expansion. It demonstrated that even the powerful armies of the steppe could face determined resistance. And, as the Mongol Empire continued evolving across Eurasia, its expansion would gradually give way to a different phase of history. A time when trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange would connect distant parts of the Mongol world. A period often remembered as the Pax Mongolica. After many decades of conquest, the Mongol Empire had become the largest land empire the world had ever seen. Its territory stretched across enormous distances, from the forests of Eastern Europe to the deserts of Persia to the fertile lands of northern China. For generations before the Mongols, these regions had been divided among many rival kingdoms and cultures. Trade routes were often dangerous. Bandits and local conflicts could interrupt long journeys. Travel across Eurasia required patience and courage. But during the height of Mongol rule, something remarkable began to happen. A period of relative stability emerged across the vast territories controlled by the Mongol states. Historians later called this period the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. The Mongol rulers understood that commerce and communication could strengthen their empire. Trade brought wealth. Travel brought information. And connections between distant regions allowed ideas to spread. Because the Mongol Empire controlled so much of the Silk Road, they had the ability to protect these routes. Merchants traveling across Asia often carried special passes known as paisa. These small metal tablets acted like official passports. When presented at Mongol relay stations or local authorities, they guaranteed protection and assistance. Along the great trade routes, the Mongols also maintained an impressive communication system known as the Yam. This network included relay stations placed across enormous distances. At each station, fresh horses and supplies were available for messengers. A courier could ride quickly from one station to the next. This allowed messages to travel hundreds of kilometers in a very short time. Compared with earlier systems, the Mongol relay network was remarkably efficient. It allowed the rulers of distant regions to remain connected. Orders could travel quickly across the empire. Information about trade, diplomacy, or military matters moved faster than ever before. But the effects of the Pax Mongolica extended far beyond administration. The safety of the trade routes encouraged merchants to travel longer distances. Caravans moved across Central Asia. Ships connected ports along the Indian Ocean. Markets in Persia traded goods from China. European merchants began exploring eastern trade routes more actively. One of the most famous travelers of this era was Marco Polo. Marco Polo was a merchant from the city of Venice. In the late 13th century, he traveled eastward along the Silk Road with his father and uncle. Their journey eventually brought them to the court of Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan. By that time, he ruled the Mongol territories in China as the founder of the Yuan dynasty. Marco Polo later wrote about his travels in a book that became famous across Europe. His descriptions of the Mongol world fascinated many readers. He described great cities, busy trade routes, and the immense power of the Mongol rulers. While some details in his account may have been exaggerated, his journey symbolized the growing connections between distant parts of Eurasia. Under Mongol rule, goods and ideas traveled farther than ever before. Paper money used in China became known to visitors from the West. New agricultural products spread between regions. Technologies and knowledge moved across cultures. Even religions traveled along these routes. The Mongol rulers themselves were often tolerant of different faiths. Within their territories, people practiced Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and many other traditions. This diversity reflected the enormous range of cultures within the empire. Yet the Pax Mongolica was not entirely peaceful. The stability of trade routes depended heavily on Mongol authority. Where Mongol power weakened, conflicts could return. And the movement of people and goods across long distances also had unintended consequences. One of the most devastating was the spread of disease. During the 14th century, a deadly illness known as the Black Death began moving along the same trade routes that had flourished under Mongol protection. The disease traveled from Asia toward Europe, carried by fleas on rats that lived aboard caravans and ships. When it reached European cities, the results were catastrophic. Millions of people died. Entire communities were transformed. Although the Mongol Empire did not create the plague, the interconnected world that developed during the Pax Mongolica allowed the disease to spread more rapidly. By the mid-14th century, the effects of war, disease, and political division were beginning to weaken the Mongol states. Different branches of the Mongol royal family ruled separate regions. The Golden Horde controlled the western steppes. The Ilkhanate governed Persia. The Yuan dynasty ruled China. And the Chagatai Khanate dominated Central Asia. These states remained connected by shared heritage, but their interests were no longer identical. Gradually, the great empire created by Genghis Khan was evolving into several independent powers. Yet, even as political unity faded, the legacy of the Pax Mongolica remained. Trade routes continued operating. Cultural exchange continued shaping societies. And the vast networks created during the Mongol era would influence Eurasian history for centuries to come. For many decades after the conquests of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire remained the largest continuous land empire in human history. Its riders had crossed deserts, mountains, and forests. They had defeated powerful kingdoms, and they had created a network of trade and communication stretching across Eurasia. Yet governing such a vast territory was never simple. The Mongol Empire had been built through the leadership of a single powerful family. The descendants of Genghis Khan ruled enormous regions. Each branch of the royal lineage controlled different lands. For a time, this system worked well. The great Khan remained the symbolic leader of the entire empire. regional rulers governed distant territories, but acknowledged the authority of the central Mongol court. However, as the decades passed, distance and local interests slowly began to reshape the political structure of the empire. Communication between distant regions became more complicated. Different parts of the empire faced different challenges, and the descendants of Genghis Khan sometimes disagreed about leadership and policy. Gradually, the single Mongol Empire began evolving into several separate Mongol states. Historians often describe 4 major khanates that emerged from the original empire. Each of these states shared Mongol heritage, but each developed its own identity and political direction. The first and perhaps most famous of these states was the Yuan dynasty in China. This dynasty was established by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, in 1271. Kublai formally declared the founding of a new Chinese dynasty under Mongol rule. The Yuan dynasty governed a vast and complex society. China possessed an enormous population, advanced agriculture, and a sophisticated system of government that had evolved over many centuries. To rule effectively, Kublai Khan adopted many Chinese administrative practices. He employed scholars and officials familiar with Chinese governance. At the same time, Mongol elites remained at the top of the political hierarchy. This combination created a unique political system. It blended Mongol military leadership with Chinese administrative traditions. Meanwhile, far to the west, another Mongol state emerged across the lands of the Eurasian steppe. This was the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was founded by the descendants of Batu Khan. Its territories stretched across the plains north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. From this region, the rulers of the Golden Horde governed the Rus principalities. Russian princes paid tribute. Trade routes connected the steppe with cities along the Volga River. Over time, the rulers of the Golden Horde adopted aspects of the cultures they governed. Many eventually embraced Islam. This cultural adaptation reflected the diverse influences present across the Mongol world. Farther south, in the lands of Persia and Mesopotamia, the Mongol rulers established the Ilkhanate. This state had originally been created during the campaigns of Hulagu Khan. The Ilkhanate governed regions that had once belonged to ancient Persian and Islamic civilizations. Cities such as Tabriz and Baghdad became important centers of administration and trade. Like the rulers of the Golden Horde, the Mongol leaders of the Ilkhanate gradually adapted to local traditions. In the early 14th century, several Ilkhanate rulers converted to Islam. This transformation reflected the cultural blending that occurred throughout the Mongol territories. Finally, in the heart of Central Asia, another Mongol state continued under the descendants of Chagatai, one of Genghis Khan's sons. This region became known as the Chagatai Khanate. Its lands stretched across the old Silk Road routes linking east and west. Cities such as Samarkand and Bukhara once again served as important trading centers. Yet political stability within the Chagatai Khanate often proved difficult. Local leaders competed for power. Nomadic traditions sometimes clashed with the needs of settled populations. Despite these challenges, the region remained an important crossroads between different parts of the Mongol world. Together, these 4 khanates represented the transformation of the Mongol Empire. The empire had not disappeared, but it was no longer governed as a single unified state. Each khanate pursued its own political priorities. Sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they competed. Trade and cultural exchange continued connecting the regions, but the era of unified Mongol leadership was slowly fading. Over the following centuries, these Mongol states would continue influencing the history of Eurasia. In China, the Yuan dynasty would face rebellion and eventually fall. In the western steppe, the Golden Horde would shape the development of Russia. In Persia, the Ilkhanate would leave lasting cultural legacies, and in Central Asia, the traditions of the Chagatai Khanate would influence future empires. The Mongol world was changing, yet the memory of the original empire remained powerful, and the legacy of the riders of the steppe would continue shaping history long after their political unity had faded. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Mongol world had changed greatly from the days of Genghis Khan. The empire that once moved like a single force across Eurasia had gradually divided into separate khanates. Each region still remembered its Mongol origins. Each ruler could trace their ancestry back to the great conqueror of the steppe, yet their political goals were no longer always the same. Distance played an important role in this transformation. The territories of the Mongol Empire stretched across thousands of kilometers. Communication between distant regions could take weeks or months. Even with the Yam relay system, governing such a vast area required cooperation among many rulers. Over time, those rulers developed their own priorities. The Golden Horde focused on controlling trade and tribute from the Rus lands. The Ilkhanate governed Persia and the Middle East. The Yuan dynasty ruled China with its enormous population and complex administration, and the Chagatai Khanate managed the difficult balance between nomadic traditions and settled cities in Central Asia. These regions were still connected through family heritage, but their political decisions increasingly followed local needs. Another challenge came from cultural adaptation. When the Mongols first began their conquests, their society was built around the traditions of the steppe: mobility, military discipline, and loyalty to the ruling family. But as Mongol rulers governed settled populations, they gradually adopted elements of local culture. In Persia, Ilkhanate rulers embraced Islam. In China, the Yuan dynasty adopted many Chinese administrative practices. These adaptations helped Mongol rulers govern effectively, yet they also made the khanates more culturally distinct from one another. In some ways, the Mongol Empire was slowly becoming less Mongol. Economic pressures also contributed to change. The great conquests of the 13th century had brought enormous wealth. Tribute from conquered territories supported Mongol courts and armies. But as expansion slowed, new sources of wealth became harder to find. Maintaining large armies and administrative systems required resources, and when those resources became strained, internal tensions sometimes grew. One of the most important turning points occurred in China. The Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, faced increasing difficulties during the 14th century. China was vast and heavily populated. Natural disasters sometimes damaged harvests. Floods affected major rivers, and economic problems placed pressure on both farmers and city populations. At the same time, some Chinese communities resented foreign rule. Rebellions began appearing in different regions. Among the most famous of these movements was the Red Turban Rebellion. This uprising gradually gained strength during the mid-14th century. Rebel forces captured cities. Local leaders gathered support among the population. Eventually, one of these leaders, Zhu Yuanzhang, rose to prominence. In 1368, his forces captured the Yuan capital. The Mongol rulers of China retreated north toward Mongolia. Zhu Yuanzhang established a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty. With this event, Mongol rule in China came to an end. Elsewhere across the Mongol world, similar transformations were taking place. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed during the 14th century after the death of its final strong rulers. Without clear leadership, the region fragmented into smaller states. In the western steppe, the Golden Horde continued to influence Eastern Europe. But even there, internal conflicts sometimes weakened the Khanate. Different Mongol princes competed for power. local leaders gained greater independence. Despite these changes, the influence of the Mongol era did not disappear. Trade routes across Eurasia continued operating. Cultural exchanges between East and West had already reshaped many societies, and the political boundaries created during the Mongol period would continue affecting future empires. When historians look back on the decline of the Mongol Empire, it often becomes clear that no single event caused its transformation. Instead, the empire gradually evolved. It expanded rapidly under the leadership of extraordinary commanders. Then, as the world it governed grew more complex, its unity slowly gave way to regional identities. In a way, this transformation reflects a pattern seen throughout history. Great empires rise through energy, ambition, and leadership. But as they grow larger, the challenge of governing distant lands becomes more difficult. The Mongol Empire was no exception. Its decline did not erase its achievements. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in Eurasian history, a chapter shaped by the legacy of the steppe riders who had once connected half the world. As the centuries passed, the political power of the Mongol Empire slowly faded. The great khanates that once ruled across Eurasia gradually transformed or disappeared. New kingdoms rose in their place. New dynasties shaped the future of many regions. Yet, even after the empire itself had declined, its influence continued quietly shaping the world. The Mongol conquests had connected vast parts of Eurasia in ways that had never happened before. Before the rise of Genghis Khan, many civilizations across the continent had lived largely separate from one another. China, Persia, the Middle East, the steppes, and Europe each followed their own paths. Trade and communication existed, but often moved slowly and unpredictably. The Mongol Empire changed that. For a brief but remarkable period in history, a single political network stretched across the heart of Eurasia. Caravans could travel thousands of kilometers under Mongol protection. Diplomats moved between distant courts. Merchants carried goods from one civilization to another. Ideas crossed mountains and deserts. And cultures that had once been far apart began interacting more frequently. In many ways, this created one of the earliest forms of globalization. Technologies spread across continents. Gunpowder knowledge moved westward. Printing techniques traveled beyond China. Navigation tools improved as knowledge moved between regions. Even artistic styles reflected these exchanges. Patterns from Persia appeared in Chinese designs. Chinese ceramics reached markets in the Middle East and Europe. The Mongol world became a crossroads of cultures. Of course, this era also carried darker consequences. The same trade routes that allowed merchants and travelers to move freely also allowed diseases to spread. The Black Death traveled along these networks during the 14th century. Entire cities across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe experienced enormous loss of life. This tragedy reshaped societies across Eurasia. Yet, even in the midst of hardship, the long-term connections established during the Mongol era did not disappear. Trade routes continued operating long after the Mongol states declined. Diplomatic contacts between East and West continued developing. European travelers remained curious about the lands of Asia. In the centuries that followed, these connections would eventually influence the Age of Exploration. Another lasting effect of the Mongol era can be seen in the political development of several regions. In Russia, the period of Mongol rule under the Golden Horde shaped the rise of new centers of power. The Principality of Moscow gradually gained influence while serving as a collector of tribute for the Mongols. Over time, this position helped Moscow strengthen its authority among the Rus territories. In China, the fall of the Yuan dynasty allowed the Ming dynasty to emerge. Yet, many administrative and economic structures created during the Mongol period continued functioning. Trade networks established under the Yuan dynasty remained important, and Chinese interactions with Central Asia continued for centuries. In Persia, the Ilkhanate period influenced architecture, art, and scholarship. Cultural blending between Mongol traditions and Persian heritage produced unique artistic achievements. Historians studying the Mongol Empire often focus on its dramatic conquests: the thunder of cavalry, the fall of cities, the rise of a nomadic empire that reshaped half the world. Yet, when we look more quietly at history, another story begins to appear. The Mongols were not only conquerors, they were also connectors. They linked distant civilizations through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. And in doing so, they helped shape the early foundations of a more interconnected world. Personally, when reflecting on the story of the Mongol Empire, one cannot help noticing how surprising its origins were. The empire began with scattered tribes on the windswept grasslands of Mongolia, families who lived in portable tents, communities who followed their herds across the seasons. From such humble beginnings, an empire emerged that would influence the course of world history. It reminds us that history often begins in unexpected places, and that the forces shaping the world sometimes come from regions few people once considered powerful. Today, the vast Mongol Empire no longer exists. The Khanates have faded into history, but the memory of the riders of the steppe still echoes across many cultures. Their legacy lives quietly in trade routes, political traditions, and stories passed down through generations. And as we approach the end of this long journey through Mongol history, the winds of the steppe still seem to carry a distant echo. The sound of horses moving across endless grasslands, a reminder of the time when a people of the open plains briefly changed the history of the world. Now, as our long journey through the history of the Mongol Empire slowly comes to an end, the world of the steppe grows quiet again. For many hours we have traveled across centuries, across deserts and mountains, across cities and grasslands. We have followed the riders of Mongolia from their earliest beginnings to the height of an empire that once stretched across half the known world. But in this final moment, the noise of war fades away. The battles grow distant, and what remains is something quieter, a story carried gently across time. Imagine the Mongolian steppe once more. Wide open land beneath an endless sky, soft winds moving slowly through tall grass, horses grazing quietly across the plains. In the distance, a few small tents stand against the horizon. Life on the steppe moves at its own steady rhythm. Seasons change slowly. Families travel with their herds. Children learn to ride horses almost as soon as they learn to walk. Long before the rise of empires, this land shaped the people who lived upon it. It taught resilience, patience, and an understanding of distance and movement. From this quiet landscape, a boy named Temujin was born. At the time, no one could have imagined the future waiting before him. His childhood was filled with hardship. His family struggled for survival. The world around him was divided among rival tribes, but slowly, over many years, Temujin built alliances. He earned loyalty. He transformed scattered groups of riders into a disciplined force. Eventually, he became known as Genghis Khan. Under his leadership, the tribes of the steppe united. And from that unity, a great wave of movement began. Armies rode outward across Asia, across deserts and rivers, across mountain passes and endless plains. Cities rose and fell. Kingdoms changed, and the map of Eurasia transformed. For a time, the Mongol Empire connected lands that had once been separated by enormous distances. Merchants traveled safely across the Silk Road. Diplomats moved between distant courts. Ideas and technologies crossed continents. The world became a little more connected than it had ever been before. Yet, like all great empires, the Mongol Empire eventually changed. Its rulers governed distant lands. Its territories divided into separate khanats. New kingdoms rose, old dynasties disappeared, and the empire slowly became part of history. But the story of the Mongols never truly vanished. Even today, their legacy can still be seen in many places, in the trade routes that once connected Asia and Europe, in the histories of Russia, China, Persia, and Central Asia, in the traditions of Mongolia itself. Sometimes, history is remembered through great monuments, through stone cities or towering castles, but the legacy of the Mongols is often quieter. It lives in movement, in connections, in the paths that travelers followed across continents. Personally, when reflecting on this long journey through Mongol history, one thought often returns again and again. It is the remarkable contrast between beginnings and outcomes. The Mongol Empire began among small nomadic communities, people who lived in portable homes, people who followed the rhythm of seasons. They did not build enormous cities. They did not leave behind vast monuments of stone. And yet, from that quiet beginning, they changed the course of world history. It is a reminder that history is rarely predictable. Great transformation sometimes begin in the most unexpected places. Now, as night grows deeper, we can allow the story to gently fade into silence. The riders of the steppe return to the horizon. The sound of hooves becomes distant. The winds move softly across the grasslands once more. The great cities of history grow quiet, and the long road of the Silk Route disappears into the darkness of time. If you listen carefully, you might almost hear the quiet breathing of horses resting beneath the stars. A peaceful steppe beneath a wide sky, the same sky that once watched the rise of empires, and now watches over the quiet earth. And slowly, very slowly, the story of the Mongols drifts into the calm stillness of the night, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind, moving endlessly across the grasslands of Mongolia.